Hey everyone, welcome back. This is the third and final part of the lengthy discussion that Sam, Portergauge, and I had about Anduin Rin. When we last left off, we had just finished discussing Battle for Azeroth, so now we're going to jump right into talking about Shadows Rising.
That might mark a good place to transition into Shadows Rising because one of the big focal stories is Anduin. And on that line, one of the things I really like in that book is how Anduin is very much bottling all those things up. He is very much suppressing his own needs, suppressing his anxieties, and very much almost tunnel visioning on the idea of I need results. I need to prove myself as king, prove that I can ensure the safety of my people, ensure the long-lasting peace for my people after Legion and after BFA. And characters blame him for things. Characters sometimes irrationally blame him for things. Characters have big expectations for him, and he buckles under them because those kind of things are hard. And we see him trying to bottle those things up because he doesn't really have a place to let those things out. And it is unhealthy for him because who is he going to tell all of his fears to? Who is he going to depend on when he is the apex of an entire faction?
And he doesn't have anyone. Even Jaina can't fully fit that role, which is the interesting thing. Like even in the scene in the tavern, right, it's a little bit of alleviation, but it's not the full thing. It's like a temporary.
It's a moment of Jaina understanding why he did what he did, but not necessarily helping him find better solutions. It is mostly just, I understand, don't do it again, let's get you back to your soul-crushing responsibilities, Anduin.
Even following on to that and Visions and Azoth as well, too, with that. Even after Rathian comes back and he does everything he does and he asks for Anduin's help in regards to, mobilizing the champions and stuff like that. Anduin past that does not help Rathian. Like you said, Anduin kind of disappears from the story after that, too, by the way. Like, he doesn't mention Rathian again. It's like Rathian never really existed. And then Shadowlands kicks in, so even less of any sort of connection between them. Again, that feeling of Anduin not doing enough, but when he has the chance to not do something, like he had the chance to try and personally help Rathian in those bits. He did not do that. That could also be a character flaw that they can engage with here. That sometimes, like, when he had the chance to help people right in front of him, he didn't take it because he was still feeling petty. I like that. I personally like that as a character flaw for Anduin. He's overly judgmental in a sense of, like, he will continue to judge people even though he has no proper grounds to do so. He's repressed in more than ways than one than just his emotions and stuff like that. I mean, I can joke there. And that he can be quite petty and he can hold, like, I'm using a very poor word for the sense of petty, but the idea that Anduin is almost vengeful in a sense. I mean, it's ironic. This could have been the bit that they could have created a proper foil with Sylvanas and Anduin, the idea that Anduin can be quite vengeful as well. But that sort of idea and the perpetuation of that.
If you want to word it a bit more perhaps virtuously, is that Anduin is a character who very much upholds an idea of justice, like Sylvanas does. And when they don't have a very easy, obvious target to take it out on, they can take it out on the wrong person. They can take it out on people who perhaps don't deserve it, who perhaps could help them with those feelings if they weren't such an easy target.
Yeah, if they weren't so constipated. Again, the writing lends itself to this, but whether the devs can pick up on, like I said, the two earlier examples, like the first example that I use will be a dead-end characterization for Anduin, because again, it lets him get away with things that, again, like I said, even if you cut it down to the basic ideas of Rathian did the wrong thing, he deserved a punch, okay, but you need something to be an equitable mirror in regards to Anduin's actions. If you don't have that, you're going to start creating a character that, well, we've already seen it happening with Anduin, that everyone starts disliking, because even though his character has that possibility for nuance, there is no other characters who are engaging that. The devs aren't allowing a character to engage that, so it creates a very, like, okay, Anduin hasn't done anything wrong, they all deserved it, Anduin just has to bear the awful actions of all the terrible people around him all the time.
That touches a lot on Shadowlands issues. So before we get there, do we want to kind of explain Shadows Rising and what we like about Shadows Rising?
Yeah, Shadows Rising, yeah. Let's go, because like we all agree with Shadows Rising, this actually did have some bits where a little bit of like that sort of really tasty sort of end, like it showed Anduin as a person with these doubts essentially, but in a way that didn't alleviate him of responsibility immediately or anything like that.
Which I guess we can just go through the Anduin bits, because largely, despite him being in this book, he is not the most consequential to the plot. The plot is mostly about Nathanos and Talanji and the Horde side of things. But with Anduin, the book opens on Anduin in Westfall. Basically, I forget if it was him going out for like trying to just find some fresh air of sorts, or just...
I think he was supposed to meet Ilaria out there to rendezvous to get a report from her, and they just happened to stumble across.
They find some peasants of sorts, one of whom is a widower who lost his husband in BFA in the Fourth War. And he's drunk. He is very much blaming Anduin, very much asking why he didn't do more, very spiteful towards Anduin. From his perspective, justifiably so. From a narrative perspective, not so much, because Anduin didn't cause that. Anduin wasn't the cause of the things, but it makes sense why this character does this, and it makes sense why Anduin responds so strongly, why this is the impetus for his arc in this book, of he is confronted face first with the reality of his leadership, with what being a king means. And perhaps, if the story wants to address it, what being a mildly incompetent king means.
Shaw even has like a great line. They're talking about Varian's reign, and Shaw makes like a little offhand comment like, some reigns are more challenging to serve than others. The implication being that he finds Anduin to be more challenging to manage than Varian, which I love.
It's a very fun moment for Shaw, because Shaw is otherwise a very reserved character and a very heavily royalist character, so it's fun getting to see his flaws come out in those ways, like showing his frustrations.
I love the first chapter. I recently reread it, which is why this stuff is like fresh in my mind, but I love that first chapter so much because it like really gives us a side of Anduin that we haven't seen before. Like it starts with him on Reverence, just running. He's like riding as fast as he can. There's like a really beautiful line about how he's like trying to outrun the shadows that are chasing him and things like that. And he's a little snippy with Shaw. You know, he and Shaw have some banter. So we kind of see Anduin misbehaving a little bit. And like in general, in this book, we start seeing Anduin showing some cracks. Like we're seeing how the stress of the Fourth War and being a leader has really affected him, which I think is something that was really needed. That was sorely missing from like most of BFA.
I think it was a really smart place to use it, because obviously Madeline Rue can't rewrite BFA, rewrite Anduin being this kind of perfect soft boy, but you can recontextualize it into Anduin repressing himself, Anduin putting up this facade of being this leader suffering in silence. And now that he doesn't necessarily have to do that, now that it is peacetime, now that he has very different responsibilities and much more direct responsibilities on him, we're starting to see a bit different side of that. A bit more kind of, how does he respond to the minutia? How does he respond to a situation where it isn't just fight the war, win the war, send soldiers to die?
Right. He's very frustrated. Like the thing that he's frustrated about in the first chapter is how Tronde and Milfirian just won't talk to him. They don't want to talk to him. They keep sending his messengers back with his letters unopened, and he's just so frustrated because he can't reach them. They won't listen to him. There's like nothing he can do except try again.
That's one of those interesting moments where Anduin is such a character defined by his desire for peace, and his time as a leader was pretty much entirely defined by war, was defined by conflict. And Shadows Rising was pretty much the first time where he was leading in a time of relative peace, and he was more frustrated there than ever. He was more unable to handle the minutia of politics there than he ever was during Legion or BFA. Because ultimately, how suited is he to being a leader when what would logically be the time he should thrive is the time where he seems to be suffering the most?
Right. Logically, this is the way millennia-old elves would react to the 19-year-old who spent an entire war snubbing them for resources.
It should be a position where he thrives, where he tries to figure out solutions to that problem, but instead he is just beating his head against it and coming up frustrated.
I even like the moment.
Yeah. No, go on, Sil.
No, I was just going to talk about something else I really love about that chapter is that like at the end, his anger kind of comes out again. So I don't inherently dislike Anduin being angry or his anger spilling over in moments of frustration. Like I really like that bit at the end.
It's what makes someone human.
Yes.
Is even the softest, most emotional of people have anger. Humans have anger unavoidably. And even people who are soft and emotional can act on that anger, because sometimes you bottle that stuff up a bit too much and don't know where to let that out. And you could interpret that with the stuff with Rathian. You can interpret that in this moment of he's not knowing where to put his anger in these moments. And later on, you can kind of see where that is causing cracks, where he is accidentally letting out his anger in his desperation.
Yeah, and I think it's a really great way of showing him cracking under the pressure. Like, it's a sign that something is really, really wrong, or that he's really stressed, is that he's like reacting in anger, which is something he would not normally do otherwise.
And it's one of those moments where it's written in such a good way that we get this whole chapter leading up to it, to the point where we fully understand what is going on in his head, why he is cracking under this pressure. It is not one of those things where he is just suddenly doing this and we're just left to question why. We know why, because we've given lead up to it.
Yeah, there's like this tension that's building throughout the chapter, and stuff keeps going wrong. So it's like a little microcosm of like what's happening in his entire rule is like just there's one problem after another. And no matter how hard he tries, he can't change the outcome. And then that at the end, he snaps, and it's just like he looks at it, and there's like another line where he's like, oh, just another thing to mend. And it's, I don't know, it's great. I think it's really well done. I love it so much.
Plus, as well, I think that someone brought up ages ago too, you know, the thing with the coin purse as well. It still shows that sort of arrogance of like, and it's unintentional, I think, but like it's a good little bit that in front of these poor Westphalian like farmers, Anduin's moaning and griping about his wallet that's full of coin. You know, like these people haven't seen a coin in fucking years, and Anduin's like, yeah, oh my god, it's like a coin purse that's bursting. It's another good point that could be played into is Anduin's sort of privilege that he does have as a ruler, and despite everything, I mean, he's never been want of anything. However, I do feel that Shadows Rising does so well like encapsulate those struggles, and like just both been saying like how so many things are stacking up against him. And you know what, Anduin probably hasn't had the chance to deal with so many things going wrong in his life in such a short amount of time because of that privilege of being like a royal. Like he's never had to worry about food or shelter. The worst he's ever had to worry about is essentially like people kidnapping him, wars and stuff.
Well, that's really one of those things that prior to being king, the most he had to worry about was things happening to him. It's one of the things that I'll bring up later. He was largely sheltered, and the things he chose to do, he chose to do. He was not forced into Pandaria. He was not forced into going out on his adventures. Nobody expected that of him. It was things he wanted to do. Whereas when he became king, suddenly he had all of these obligations. He had the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he personally had to deal with them. Nobody else could. He didn't have someone like himself to go solve things unconventionally. He didn't have what Varian had in himself.
This book does do a very, very good job. Once again, it was vitally needed, this book, and it's just a bloody shame that it's, you know, whether we'll see this Anduin again is another question, but we'll see. Anyway, so next sections, the next part of the book with Anduin.
Well, that chapter does end on kind of like the impetus of the story of tasking Illyria to find Sylvanas, of no matter what, find Sylvanas, because we need to bring her to justice, because that is very much his big... I mean, in the chapter, the widower I mentioned, of one of the drunk characters also mentions like he was there at Arathi, which Anduin in this chapter kind of thinks about how much he regrets that, how much he regrets trusting Sylvanas, and he has this kind of thought in the back of his head of, can I trust Illyria either? She's a windrunner. She's corrupted by the void. And then you get this moment of like, no, I need to think rationally. And it's those kind of moments in this book I love, of characters going on these kind of irrational rambles in their heads and then being able to compose themselves and go, no, those are my irrational thoughts. These are the things I know logically. And it makes the moments later in the book so much better, because it makes you realize these are his irrational thoughts. These are Anduin or Nathanos or Talanji's irrational thoughts. And in the heat of those moments, they don't have the time to compose themselves and get to the rational thought.
And then it still lingers for the reader as well. Like you said, even if the character composes themselves, like for us, in this case, Anduin, we still have to wonder whether that thought does still linger for him as well, despite everything.
If they're building up to some kind of like not quite a corruption arc, but Anduin turning to the shadows. I think that paranoia is like a really good way to set that up. And it's something I wish we would have seen more of going into Shadowlands.
It's going to be an interesting thing to see in The War Within, because like I said, he has this kind of irrational, nagging thought in the back of his head of how different is Illyria from her sister? How far is she willing to go if someone so like Illyria, so equally corrupted by darkness, is willing to go that route? And even though he does ultimately have this kind of mended relationship with Sylvanas, Sylvanas also has the excuse of her whole soul sundering thing. Illyria doesn't.
My evil side. And Illyria's like, I could have an evil side. I'm just not showing anyone.
Verisa in the corner. I totally have evil sides. I swear, I did ethnic cleansing. Focus on me, please.
Torch is okay. That was my alter ego.
Oh my god, the torture. Can I talk about how much I love that little detail in the Shadows Rising book?
So go ahead on how much you love torture.
Okay. Anduin signing off on torture. Okay, so like at the time, I remember on social media when I was more like into the Anduin quote unquote fandom, that scene was like highly controversial because it was like Anduin would never approve of torture. Like, what is this? And inside, I was just like so giddy because this is like exactly the kind of stuff I wanted to see for him. Him being like pushed to these like extremes and kind of doing something really quote unquote out of character or something really extreme because he's that focused on getting results and proving himself as king. And he just really is obsessed with Sylvanas and capturing her to that extent that it pushes him to being like, yeah, Turalyon and Illyria, you can torture civilians, mind control them for information. I loved it, but I was kind of quiet about it at the time because I kind of was like reading the room and I was like, okay, maybe now is not the time to go on like a multi-tweet thread about how much I love this.
Like I said earlier, it's one of those interesting things where Anduin almost didn't need to deal with those things in the last two wars he was going under because those kind of things were so broad of such a big faction doing these things that when was Anduin going to be informed that Chandra's killed some random troll civilians during the war campaign? He's busy with other much bigger things. When is he going to be informed of some of the stuff that characters did all over Zandalar during the Battle for Dazar'alor? He has other things to do, but now, at this point, there's no war. There is this big responsibility he has, and he needs to be the one to oversee it. And now, he is much more directly involved in this process than he was before. He is tasking two very close, high-ranking advisors to do this.
He's getting his hands dirty.
Yeah, he's getting this very clear message, like, Jaina goes and finds them, tries to get a progress, and finds them just torturing this random fisherman. And it's what makes the story so interesting for them on that side. Small tangent is in that first scene, it is one of those like these are Horde civilians. These are Horde characters, but they're being aggressive. They're being obviously protective of themselves because they're being confronted by Lord Commander Turalyon and Illyria Windrunner. And this is an orc woman. Of course they would be protective of themselves.
Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't just go quietly and be like, oh yes, anything you want, blah, blah, blah.
So it's this moment where they're very like, even Illyria and Turalyon are very like, do we want to do this? Are we willing to go this far? And they have to very much steel themselves to like, we hate this. We don't want to be doing this, but we need to find Sylvanas. We need to figure out what she's up to right now. And so they begrudgingly do it. And then the next time we see them, we don't see from their perspective. We see it from Jaina's perspective. And from Jaina's perspective, she's not seeing the tortured internal dialogue of Illyria and Turalyon. She is seeing two vaunted war heroes torturing a civilian human. And she's horrified. And she's like, what on earth are you guys doing? Anduin is not going to approve of this. And she basically has this fun little moment in her head, like she's being like, I am 100% willing to be the goody two-shoes and rat you guys out to Anduin. And she just teleports away and she teleports to Stormwind and she very triumphantly declares all the stuff like, they're doing bad. You need to stop them. And it's just like, okay, are they getting results?
It's so good. Remember when I was talking about Death of the Fan in our previous little talk? I think this is one of those things where people need to realize that Anduin isn't a character like, I don't know, Lore Walker Cho. He isn't a character who's like unrestrained by like, you know, his things in life. Lore Walker Cho's responsibilities in life is keeping records of history. Anduin is a leader that needs to engage with wars and death and violence in those sorts of things. He can't be your little uwu good boy. These situations, or else we're going to have a very, like, from everything in WoW, I mean, this isn't a simple, like, Disney, like, supposedly according to the writers. This story has a lot of depth to it, essentially, in game.
Well, that's what we talked about a very long time ago, about 8 or so hours ago about like the Return of the King stuff of like comparing Lord of the Rings versus Game of Thrones. If Lord of the Rings is not a story that is examining the burdens of monarchy, it is not examining the politics of being a king.
It's not even examining genocide in a way.
Whereas Game of Thrones very much is. And so it's one of those stories where WoW is not necessarily a Game of Thrones level complex story, but it is a story that does go into the ideas of the burdens of leadership, the burdens of having to make hard choices.
This is the thing. You can't have your cake and eat it and be like, no, we're not going to make our leader do the war crimes because he's everyone's uwu good boy, but then say that we're going to have these darker topics that you're going to explore there. And like you said, Lord of the Rings is a bad example. And again, I'm going to, if any dev does listen to this, Lord of the Rings isn't something you should try and emulate here because it doesn't, from the story that you created so far, it can't reconcile with the story that Lord of the Rings tells, which is almost a very Arthurian, classically dictated story, as in there is the romantic heroes. And certainly they suffer the loss of home when, let's just say, Sam and Frodo and Merry and Pippin all return to the Shire at the end. But its essential core is so different from WoW. And like I said, it isn't a Game of Thrones either, World of Warcraft.
WoW is still a story that fundamentally has heroes and villains. It is not one of those stories that fundamentally goes to the idea of all people are bad in some way. All people are flawed. There are characters that are very much intended to be the good guys.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but this ain't no World Warhammer,
Thank God.
where things are ridiculously morally grey, and they know that they're being silly in Warhammer too.
Tell that to fans.
Again, death of the fan. But yeah, the idea that, like, even with my simple thread about, like, should Anduin join a cult?
Those Halafal Arathi are sure looking tempting.
I saw people, like, wringing their hands like, Anduin would never do that.
He should.
He should hurt the people around him in an attempt to find closure for himself. And that's naughty because it's human. It creates actually a very simple and effective story of humanizing a character without being, like, too dark. It works with something that's been in WoW before, the idea of cults and cultists, right? This is why I was suggesting it. It works very well within the realms of the story in WoW, and it also creates a nice little arcing narrative or an arcing theme for Anduin that one time he was against these cults, these doomsday cults, but imagine if, like, one offers him exactly what he wants, a sense of connection to the light again, a sense of belonging, a sense of duty and purpose. I think that there would be temptation there for a character like Anduin to engage with that, even if he hurts the people that he cares for around him.
I think it ties into this interesting. You said earlier this idea of Anduin he can't be the uwu good boy while he is a king, while he has these duties. And it ties into this idea, I think, that at his ideal, I would almost say Anduin is that. Anduin is the upstanding moral center. Anduin should be this fundamentally good person fighting for the most fundamentally right things. But he is tied down by the responsibilities of the throne. And it is those responsibilities that force him to make these terrible choices. It isn't Anduin thinking, oh, I'm totally fine with torturing these people. This is great. It is Anduin going, I don't like this, but my duties as king necessitate this happening. And he is so overwhelmed by that. He is cracking so much under that pressure that he tries to escape it, which kind of leads to the next scene of the next real scene we get with him, as far as I know, is him going to Goldshire, him disguising himself as Jarek and escaping to have a drink as just a regular guy in a tavern because he needs to escape that. He needs to not be King Anduin Wrynn.
And that almost creates now, this may not be the exact correct word for it, but it does create a sense of, I was going to say apathy, and I have been using the word apathy, but I think it's a type of burnout in regards to Anduin too.
I think that's the best way of having emotional burnout for him. He has been shouldering so much stuff, so many people's lives. He is so overwhelmed by it that he is torn between this gnawing guilt and just trying to shove it all down and not care. So in the scene when Jaina tattles on Illyria and Turalyon, he is just at this point of, I can't, it's not I don't care, it's I can't care. It is I cannot hold all of these emotions in my head.
stress apathy, essentially.
While still being this massive multi-nation leader. I need to get this thing done, and I can't do that without falling apart. And then on the other side, when he gets to the tavern, even when he is disguised, when no one knows who he is, when he is free to just be Jarek, to be just this random dude in a tavern, he is still haunted. He is still torn apart by the guilt of being king. Because when he looks over, he can't just see people in a tavern. He sees the soldiers that he is sending off to their deaths. He can't just listen to their conversation in peace. He listens to them and thinks, I'm sending them to their death, probably. They're going to die someday because of me. Even there, he can't escape it because, like I said before, I think one of the core things in Anduin's character to me is that he is not built to be a king. He is not the right person to be a political leader. That is not his calling. He's not one of those characters like Lorthamar where you can say the whole idea of, oh, the best person to lead is the one who doesn't want it, where Lorthamar might have these desires to go out and be a ranger, to just be that carefree person again. But Lorthamar is also very good. He is a very shrewd political leader. He is good at what he does. There is good reason why he was chosen for that. Whereas Anduin did not get that position for his shrewd politics. He got that position because he is biologically the son of the last guy who had that position. He was not groomed for that. He was, like I said, he was largely sheltered from it. He was not prepared to lose his father so suddenly and have the burdens of the world on him. He is not someone who is a good king. It's one of those moments where I can never tell if that's intentional or not, but I do very much think in Shadows Rising that is intentional.
Yes, and that is how you just compile that. There is exactly what's great about his character, but it makes me worry in a sense of like how, on a wider scale, maybe like devs and fans respond to it. Like, well, no, then he needs to grow to become a good king. I worry about that.
Yeah, that's like the very easy, very boring conclusion to his arc is he learns how to lead properly and he comes back and he is the good king now. He is like Varian. Or he's better than Varian because he has his own magical peace ways of leading. And not the idea that I think appeals to me so much with Anduin is how fundamentally he is. I don't think intentionally an indictment of politics. He is an indictment of the idea that you can be a flawlessly good person in politics because, as we all know, not very many politicians are good people. And it's one of those moments where how many times have we seen idealist, progressive people go into politics and over the years just seemingly just fall to the corruption in politics, fall away from their ideals, fall away from their progressivism, and just go to the corporate system, going to the status quo, because we might not see it from that perspective, but from what politicians in those positions have talked about, they just lose their drive. They lose their idealism because of how soul-crushing that system is, how hopeless it is in that system trying to enact their ideals, and how much compromise they have to make, how many things in their lives and in their ideals they need to put aside for the idea of getting things done. And I think that very much applies to Anduin too, where Anduin is the progressive ideal, and the progressive ideal does not fit in a situation like being a politician, of like being a king.
That is my overwhelming worry in regards to like that they'll just go for that simple story, like he just needs to learn to become a good king, or he needs to learn like how much people need him, and it's like I don't think that's been working, guys.
It's one of those things where I think it especially doesn't work when, like I said earlier, he doesn't have a version of himself to lean on like Varian did. There's no one in that position for him to make this idea of, okay, if we are saying that this one person can't shoulder all these burdens, who is going to help him with that? With Varian, it was Anduin. It was his young idealist son who got to have the drive to do the right thing. He got the privilege of not having those things so that someone else could do the hard stuff, that Varian could do the hard stuff. Anduin doesn't have that right now. The closest he has is Gen, but Gen is not that. Gen is not the equivalent to what Anduin was for Varian.
I would even say, to argue at the moment with Gen's characterization, I actually don't really know who Gen is as a character, because we've had so many iterations of Gen.
I think we had a very strong kind of delineation between who he was to the Alliance versus who he was in regards to the Horde, where his story with casting off those ideas of isolation, casting off that selfish tendency as a leader, and learning unity, learning cooperation with the leaders of the Alliance. And then on the Horde side, he had those ideas of vengeance against Sylvanas, of how far he's willing to go against Sylvanas. But then unfortunately, BFA and Shadowlands kind of robbed again of all of that and gave it to Tyrande. And now in Dragonflight, all of his ideas of cooperation and those things that made him such a good alliance leader largely got given to Tess. Tess got those ideas of cooperation, and she's even more cooperative because she did it with the Horde too. She did it with the Forsaken. And so Gen gives up leadership. Gen gives up the position that defines his character and gave it to Tess. So what is Gen now? Gen solely exists for Anduin, essentially.
It sort of has that moment where I'm like, I don't know why this character is still here. If they're giving, like you said, if they're giving all that to Tess.
It's one of those things where anything that Gen could really fill, I think Jaina would fill significantly better because they have such a more fundamental bond, and Jaina has story, she has connections other than Anduin. She has things to do in the story in regards to being a mage, in regards to being the leader of Kultiris, in regards to her connections to Arthas, her connections to Varian, her connections to Thrall. She is such a more well-rounded character. Not to say Gen is a bad character. I do think Gen has largely been a very good character a lot of the time, but I think he very rapidly got stripped of that over the last 2 expansions.
Exactly. They really tried to like file down his edges, and now we got Tess with the ultimate file down edges.
Very Lily file off his edges because now he has this bloated, stung by a bee face model.
Basically, they're just nice and smooth and very palatable. And like you said, I don't know what Gen is to Anduin anymore, unless they're trying to really push that father angle. But again, I think that leads me into my points that I made before. I think that Anduin would be better feeling that sort of level of almost pain in regards to Varian's memory. And I don't think that having Gen there as a substitute father adds anything to that story. I think it needs to be resolved in a sense of how Anduin feels about Varian's death, which we thought that we covered already. But unless they cover it again, like Anduin still has that lingering anger that Varian left so much on him.
Well, that really is one of those interesting things is if you didn't really think on his character and you didn't read stuff like Shadows Rising, you'd think that he pretty much just solved all of his trauma in 7.2. You would think that he is just perfectly moved on from his father's death and nothing is wrong, and that the only slightest hint of it still being there is N'Zoth acting on his worst instincts and not anything actually having to do with Anduin.
And then Shadowlands compiles that with the, the ghost scene of Anduin, you can do it. I'm a forced ghost.
Which ties very interestingly into The War Within, where that moment, Thrall putting his hand on his shoulder, reminding him of that moment.
The world needs your light again, my son.
Obviously, the most explicit part is that reminds him of his domination, that reminds him of his trauma. But that specific moment is Varian doing that. It is his father putting his hand there, and that is where he lashes out. In a very funny moment, it is Thrall, voiced by Chris Metzen, reminding Anduin of Varian, voiced by Chris Metzen.
Anduin, it's me, your father, Chris Metzen. Varian.
He's just going to meet the ghost of Nefarian and go berserk, because it's also Chris Metzen, and then he's going to meet Ragnaros, and he's going to go crazy, because it's also Chris Metzen.
Just, what are they going to do with that? And I still think that probably my thing is that Anduin's going to feel some lingering resentment towards Varian, but they've done such a bad job of setting that up, I think, so far. It's certainly the best way that you can resolve it, I feel.
I think the War Within stuff sets it up well enough that the implicit moment is there so that if they want to, they can draw on it without it feeling sudden, because his last real big plot thing in Shadowlands was that moment of his father showing up, and then the War Within moment kind of reminds you of it and very clearly connects the idea of Anduin has trauma about that moment, has trauma in relation to that moment with his father. What does that mean beyond just he is afraid of his time being dominated? Because there has to be something deeper there than just that.
Us with our clown makeup, there's got to be something deeper, right? We can hope, and we're saying it here nice and loud and clear so people can ruminate on it at least. But yeah, so like that is there, and it's like such a good point that they can still draw on that lingering sort of like anger that Varian dumped all of this on Anduin. But I hope that they don't just resolve it like we've been saying, is Anduin comes back and he's a better king than Varian ever was because of his super cool powers of pacifism and stuff like that.
Continuing on a bit about that chapter in Shadows Rising of him being Jarek, of him hiding. There's this one quote from the book that I just really loved of him being approached by someone and him being kind of almost fearful of someone finding him out, of like coming to him with these obligations. And then he has this thing of, then he remembered that he wasn't Anduin just then, so it was all right to glance at her. He let himself sink into the delirious joy of anonymity. And it's just this idea of he really wishes he could be someone other than King Anduin Wrynn. He so desperately wishes he could not have that responsibility, and it's what makes it so interesting going forward is the War Within almost seems like it's going to isolate just the addressing of his trauma, of like what is he dealing with post Shadowlands, what is Anduin dealing with then, and I almost don't know if they're even going to touch on the idea of him returning to Stormwind in base War Within.
You think they're going to delay that and it's just going to be, he's going to end the expansion kind of like he started it?
Maybe do that in the patch content, I think, because obviously Midnight is inevitably going to involve Turalyon, because doing a Light versus Void expansion, you can't not have Turalyon, especially if Illyria is another main character. But I do think it's going to be one of those interesting things where he's going to bond with these two specific characters. He's going to go on these adventures in this very isolated, very nothing to do with Stormwind kind of setting, and maybe address more his connection to the light and his connection to his emotional virtues and the trauma over losing that in Shadowlands than it is his connection to being king. And I would almost like that because it would allow us to kind of see a more emotionally evolved Anduin coming back to the idea of leading and seeing how he reacts to that rather than the very emotionally repressed Anduin we've been dealing with up until then. And it's just that scene in there of just like, there's this one line that's really funny of like, the barmaid comes by, plump and beautiful, dark-skinned with a brilliant and ready smile that would have made another boy blush.
Oh, yeah.
Wow! I come back and the breasted boobly towards Anduin is being debunked. Holy shit, wow. Anduin's like, your bodacious charms do not have any sway here, plump barmaid.
He's like, oh, that's wasted on me.
That's one of those interesting moments where it's a very nice up for interpretation moment where he does have this moment of like, he lets her flirt with him. He lets her be a woman just flirting with a guy because Jarek is not him. He's playing a role in this moment. He's allowing this stuff to happen. But ultimately, that is not him.
Yeah, it's like a buffer, but it's a controlled buffer. Like, it's not like the public face he has to put on being king. It's like a persona he's created that is allowed to do.
He literally says 2 lines. He literally says, my name's Jarek. What do I call you? And she says, Amalia. He says, that's a lovely name. And then she just curtsies and walks away. And then in it, he says, Anduin felt incredible and free. And then, of course, he felt guilty. He gets 2 seconds of being happy.
That's it.
2 seconds of feeling nice, and then he's guilty again.
Seems like the breast and boobly only has short-term effects, I think. Anyway, and once again, Medline Root making us laugh here. But yeah, immediately, like, that sort of, the anguish comes back for Anduin again in these situations. It really shows that being a king is not doing very much good for this boy's health.
Yeah.
We just say he's not having a great time here. And I feel like he would even struggle here from everything that we've seen. Even like the idea that if Anduin does become a king again, right, after War Within, that World Soul Saga, etc., the next time there is a great battle with Stormwind, is he going to go through all of this again?
That's pretty much what happens in the next thing. After that she walks away, a bunch of soldiers come into the bar of varying degrees of veteran status. They come in, they drink at his table, they talk about things. Like, one of them talks about how his father died fighting N'Zoth under the command of the Alliance. One of them is very clearly a new recruit who hasn't gone to battle yet. He's terrified of the idea that that's where they're heading after this. But we'll be champions, and that's what matters. And Anduin is just sitting there, and he is just racked with guilt. Like, he literally has this idea of, he wondered how long it would take before they turned up on a freezing slab beneath the Cathedral of Light, innocent lambs before the slaughter. His soldiers. He would command them. He would tell them to fight. For that was a king's right and a king's duty. And it's very much the thing of, it is his duty in his head sending these innocent men to their deaths. That is what being a king requires. And he is very clearly just not able to handle that. Even in this moment where he is literally, nobody knows who he is. Everyone is being the nicest possible to him. He can't get himself away from this nagging guilt of the responsibility he has to have.
I like that. It shows it so well. So I actually get a little bit baffled about people saying yes, and then Anduin will be a good king again. It just really doesn't suit his character. It just, I have like a sort of mixed feelings here. I feel like sometimes the writers are looking at that, but other times, like Madeline Rue here, takes such a good perspective of it, and I do think the specifics of this book is Anduin is not going to make a good king. Even though he's trying and he has the best of intentions, he isn't suited for it, which is really, really interesting. And I hope they don't renege on that and be like, actually though, like with the bits with Sylvanas in Shadowlands, like, you know, taking responsibility and stuff like that. I don't think that tells a good story. The idea of like just duty and responsibility. Again, it's eroding away at any sort of passion that Anduin has. He's just becoming a, like we always say, just a reactive character rather than a character with passion anymore. A character with hopes and dreams more than just peace. It's peace. I want peace. It's can only have that so much in a character's story before like their own specifics start coming out, their own wants and needs and their role within said story and how they react to people around them and then what other people mean to them and stuff like that. So
There's one last line from this that I think encapsulates these feelings on Anduin in this chapter so much before we move on. Of this quote from Anduin when he's talking to Jaina. He's like saying, "Sometimes I need this. Sometimes I need to be a boy again. I think about all the soldiers giving their life to serve the Alliance, and I think, how? How can they be so young? Those brave souls inside, they think they're ready to die for me. It isn't fair. It should make everything stop. The whole world should stop and point at that, but it doesn't. Everything just rolls on, the world forgets, and I have to pretend like their sacrifice isn't a cruel, heartbreaking joke."
Oh, yeah, that's a really good line.
It's this moment where Anduin is faced with just the fundamental injustice of what all this means and what he is having to do, and he just can't fathom why nobody else cares. And it's very clear he's just not built for this.
And the thing is that a good leader would just, I'm saying a good leader, but a leader that is more suited for the situation would understand that and, you know, just have to continue with it. Like you said, it's really tearing Anduin apart. He is just not suited for this. Also in a very booming tone, he is not suited for this shit. He should have never become a king.
There's a very funny scene after this where he's talking to Jaina about like how Jaina's like, "I'm not going to tattle on you. I was caught here too. I'm here risking myself." And Anduin's like, "At least you can show your face to Jaina, the unnaturally white-haired blonde strand mage with probably the most recognizable look on Azeroth."
Why did no one recognize Jaina? They're like, wow, sure hope great Archmage Jaina of the fucking flying ships and bullshit leader of the Kultiran Admiralty doesn't turn up in our small time inn. Holy shit!
Jaina's a mage too. It should be pretty easy for her to disguise herself.
I think in this moment that's intentional because Anduin is very clearly like, he is drunk and the drink in his stomach is going sour. He feels terrible. He's not really rational at this moment.
Should have ate some potatoes. Anduin, you should have ate some chips before you started drinking. That's the trick to it.
Creating a persona for himself as a shit shoveler? My OC, Jarek.
That's the third time someone's been allowed to swear in Warcraft.
And not only that, but again, the reiteration of Anduin thinking that people who clean stables are like, oh my god, shit shoveler. I'm like, dude, don't be fucking disrespectful. A smarmy ass little prince boy. Like, real shit. It actually points out, and that was one thing that I hope that someone would point out, but it never does in the book. The coin purse, it really shows that Anduin's a little spoilt boy. Like, when it comes down to it, it's a little bit more subconscious that, but
I have more to say to that when we get onto the Shadowlands topic, but before we get there, I think there's one last scene about Anduin in the book, which is the stockade scene.
Him using shadow magic.
Yes.
oh yeah. Which leads into, I was mind controlling, I did bad things. And I liked it, the power glove.
Yeah, this is a part of the book that I'm still very curious about, is Anduin being pushed to the point where he is involuntarily calling on the shadows, where the void responds to his anger and his frustration, and he kind of like loses control in a big way. I'm very curious to see if that's going to come up again in The War Within or Midnight.
100%. And it really leads into, now, I feel like we talked about this last time. There was a bit where Sylvanas was saying that she wanted to see Anduin's will and hope broken. And I still feel like, despite all of this, despite everything, despite even like all this book and stuff like that, we've truly never actually seen Anduin totally broken. And I do feel like they're missing out on the possibility that the best way to break Anduin is to affect people close to him, like build up his hopes once again and then crush them again in front of him. Remember when I was talking about the best way to probably do it would be to have a reconciliation with Rathian. And once again, Anduin is feeling a sense of boyish freedom again alongside Rathian, and they're doing things that they would do as lads, but now have a bit more freedom to do it as adults, and then almost kill Rathian at the end of it, but Anduin being unable to heal him because he still can't call the light. That would actually break Anduin's character. Whether they're brave enough to do something like that is another question. Like that, it's people close to Anduin. Imagine that, like the reconciliation, they become tentative friends again, they start rebuilding the trust. You actually see Anduin like happy again, smiling again, like actually having fun once again because, you know, he's just getting up to right BS with Rathian, but he feels a lot more confident because Rathian's by his side. And then almost killing Rathian right in front of him and then being able to do nothing. I think that is what would break his character. If they wanted to go like the mind control with Shadow and stuff like that. So anyway, but again, me throwing up my hands. I don't think like seeing just like the fall of the Alliance would do it, you know what I mean? Like, or the idea that he's a bad king and stuff like that. I suppose that's how I'd read his character more. It isn't just a concept that would break Anduin, it'd be a very personal connection that would break Anduin and cause him to turn to the shadow.
Which, I mean, that's one of those interesting things in this scene is the scene leading up to this is very like Anduin thinks he's ready to breathe a sigh of relief. He thinks he has found the key to solving this problem, the key to fixing things. He has this Night Elf prisoner he can give as a show of good faith to the Night Elves. He has someone who can tell him where Sylvanas is. And he gets to Syrah. He's vaguely happy having found Shaw, having gotten there. And then Syrah tells him nothing. Syrah basically just mocks him. She just kind of pokes just at the right spot of going, you realize now how little time you have left. Because the big pushing point in this book is they are on a timetable. They need to find Sylvanas before she causes any more nonsense. They need to find her or she is going to mess things up a lot. And even in this book, he kind of just breathes this sigh of like, oh my god, he just almost killed the god of death. They almost succeeded. If I hadn't gone this far, they would have succeeded. And he gets what should be a moment of catharsis for him, and he has denied that, and he is poked in just the right spot that he just kind of, the darkest point for him, and that's where that mote of shadow starts to form. And he pulls back from that, he's horrified. He looks at Jaina, and he looks at Jaina's fear, and he's even more horrified of like, how far am I going for this? How much is this affecting me? He is just kind of utterly startled by this, and Syrah has that very ominous moment of like, take heart, falling lion, you will serve well. And it's this very ominous cliffhanger at the end of the book. And that's subsequently where Anduin interesting bits end.
We're like, yeah, Shadow's rising. Thank you, Madeline Rue.
Yeah, let's see this lion fall. Woo! And then just
Ominous noise, Shadowlands.
It's this perfect idea of we are showing Anduin crack under the pressures of responsibility. We are showing the idea of, okay, we spent all of these years with these people going, Anduin and Arthas have all of these parallels. Anduin could be so much like Arthas. And the story has finally been going, as Anduin was then, as that kind of prince without those kind of responsibilities, no, Anduin fundamentally could never become Arthas like that. But now we're faced with an Anduin who does have responsibilities, who does have these weights on his shoulders, slowly chipping away at his morality, slowly chipping away at these firm lines he's not willing to cross. And the book ends with him, just for the briefest moment, falling to darkness. And so going into Shadowlands, the most obvious, this is the death expansion ever, you can kind of ask those questions of how will you draw on those parallels? How will you go with this idea of, we have Anduin kidnapped by Sylvanas, taken to hell, and basically given all of these choices of all of these explanations of justice, of cosmic injustice, and how people seek to right them, how far people are willing to go with such a massive responsibility on their shoulders. Anduin, of all people, is no stranger to the idea of having these massive responsibilities and struggling to deal with them in a way that keeps his morals. So how is he going to respond to these things? How could you tell a story of maybe, let's say, like go on a total big tangent of, if you want to do the Arthas parallel, of Anduin getting a moment of, in some way, understanding understanding why Sylvanas did what she did, of understanding, with the context of this massive cosmic scale, why she might see all of these things on Azeroth as small fry, why she might be willing to put those things as small scale morals for such a big scale justice. How might he in some way be influenced by that? How might he in some way have that dark whisper in his ear telling him, maybe this is who you are, especially when he gets Arthas' soul in a Mournblade forced on him? How might you tell a story of, with that literal corrupting voice in his ear, someone who went down this exact same path as him in Arthas, in Sylvanas, how might he react to that? And how might you have him say no? Because ultimately, the thing that would differentiate Sylvanas and Anduin in this position, as we saw in Shadows Rising, is no matter how small people are, they aren't small fried him. They aren't small in the bigger picture. Those 3 random soldiers in a tavern tore him up more than anything when he was confronted with it face to face. He could not escape his guilt over that. And that is a moment you can ultimately say, no, Anduin is not like Arthas. He is not like Sylvanas. He is not willing to go down that path. There's so many ways in which you could ask those moral questions. And I open with this for Shadowlands just to show how the concepts behind Shadowlands and Anduin's involvement are not inherently flawed. There is so much you can do with Anduin in terms of exploring his moral complexity and exploring him as a foil to Sylvanas, because exploring that idea of these two people both being fundamentally just characters, people who fundamentally recoil in disgust at injustice, and then seeing how far they are willing to go to correct those large-scale injustices at the cost of other smaller things below them. Those are very interesting ideas to explore. Shadowlands had a lot of potential, and we just, to get the disappointing part out front, did not get that.
To put it lightly.
We didn't get even 1/15 of that.
I was also very excited for Shadowlands at the start. I do think that expansion had a lot of potential, especially with regards to Anduin's character and kind of pitting him against Sylvanas in Warcraft Hell, basically. But I think we're gonna talk more about this, but it just like kind of failed in showing the nuances of his character there in that extreme situation.
It really failed on so many fronts. And I think this is the big overarching theme that we have in every single one of these points for every expansion. The potential is there. The writing already has a framework. You're like, okay, we'll just pick this and then we'll extrapolate from it. We'll start writing using this very clear artist vision, basically, writer's vision in this sense, of this is the story we want to discuss. But every time we get to an expansion, it turns into collect the 4 special objects. And it's like, okay, but what about the character stuff? I still feel like, again, the main story lets these characters down by having no focus. It's so wobbly, the focus.
I think there's also this big thing of like, this is an issue large scale with WoW more than it is specific to Shadowlands. It is something I felt in BFA, something I felt in Dragonflight, in that WoW can't really decide right now if it wants to be a story about a world or a story about a cast of characters. In that it really wants the leveling process to be this story of exploring the world and exploring the cultures of a region, exploring these quest lines that more explore, like when you look at Onaran Plains, that is not a story about characters, it is a story about a culture. The characters of Onaran Plains don't really matter. You explore the intrigue and the culture of the Centaur. But then we get to max level, and they very much do want it to be a story about a cast of characters. But we've just spent the most potent piece of story where literally every player in your entire game, no matter what, will be paying attention. You spend the entire 10 levels not telling focused stories about those characters. And it's like, the example in Dragonflight is obviously Alexstrasza and Rathian, of 2 very obvious characters that could be the focal characters of Dragonflight, which in the marketing essentially were. They were marketing those 2 when the expansion launched as the focal characters. And then you get leveling, and they get about 5 quests apiece in the Waking Shores, and then they just vanish and don't actually do anything the rest of leveling. And even during the max level stuff, they largely vanish until Alexstrasza shows up for the raid. Rathian doesn't show up again until the patch content at all. And it's the same with BFA. BFA opens with this massively bombastic event of all-out faction war. Sylvanas and Anduin, main characters of each faction. Sourfang and Jaina, secondary characters of each faction. Doing these big, massive things like the burning of Teldrassil, the battle for Lordaeron. These big faction stakes. And then we get to Zandalar and Kultiris, and barring the very initial intros, have nothing to do with the faction at all. Like, even though we have Jaina there for some of it, Jaina disappears entirely until max level. She is not in Tiergard Sound. She is not in Drustvar. She is not in Stormsong Valley. She literally, in the narrative, vanishes to another plane of existence. It's even worse on the Horde side, where Sourfang just isn't in anything. We don't even mention him. Sylvanas isn't in anything. We don't mention her beyond the undead war chief who wants our fleet. But that has nothing really to do with the faction stuff. It's just the instigating conflict. And the stories explored there are interesting. I love the story of Kultiris. I love the story of Zandalar. They're two very good stories, but they are not the story of Battle for Azeroth. They are not the story of the faction war. They are a world-building setting upon which things take place. Because when we get to the patch content, 8.1 kind of does a good job of expanding on it, but after Dazar lore, the Zandalari don't show up again in the faction war at all. The only Kultiran that shows up is Jaina, because she's not just Kultiran, she's connected to other things. They were largely just filler vessels to tell these world stories about. And then once we get to the ending of 8.1, we just tell an entirely different copy of Mists of Pandaria that is rushed through about a patch and a half because they have no time to tell that story, because we just spent the entirety of leveling, the entirety of base max level, the entire first patch focusing on a different story other than the main characters. And it's the same in Shadowlands, where we open Shadowlands with this very obvious tie-in of, okay, we just brought 4 major faction leaders to the Shadowlands from Sylvanas, the main antagonist continuing from the next expansion. We have the big threat of the jailer behind them. We meet him in the intro, and then we subsequently spend 4 zones just not doing anything with them. We get one very brief cutscene at level, God, what is it, 53? After Maldraxxus, where Bolvar briefly peers into the maw and we hear 2 lines of dialogue of Jaina and Thrall screaming. And that is the only thing we see of any of them the entirety of leveling. Everything else in leveling in Shadowlands quite literally has nothing to do with the main plot. The only thing that has to do with the main plot is the very end when Denathrius sends all of his anima to the maw. That is effectively the inciting incident of the expansion of the jailer gets a giga boost of anima from Denathrius. And then we kill Denathrius in the raid and nothing else matters from that. Because the most you can say really matters there is the introduction of Uther, because the only real character that matters to the main plot is Uther, because the main characters of Shadowlands are Anduin and Sylvanas. Those are the 2 only main characters. Not even the jailer is a main character. He is largely a secondary character who acts as motivation for other people. Jaina and Thrall and Bane, they are not main characters. They have their own tiny little plots, but you could cut them and nothing changes about the main plot. The only main characters are Sylvanas and Anduin, and the only times we see them are in the very start intro and 2 cinematics at max level. Nothing in actual gameplay at all. This largely ties to Sylvanas in that when you get to the ending of Sanctum of Domination, this is supposed to be like the culmination of everything having to do with the Moss one after this one. Everything having to do with Sylvanas as a villain. This is literally the last time we see Sylvanas as a villain. She gives this very big dramatic speech right before you pull her for the boss fight of like saying, I've tried so hard to show you guys the injustice of this cosmic system. I've tried so hard to show you the futility of everything you're trying to preserve, and still you're trying to preserve it. What a pity. This is such a shame that you guys are still futilely acting against me, trying to fix this cosmic injustice.
Despite witnessing the broken cycle of life and death with your own eyes, still, you would stop us from remaking this flawed system. What a pity. A shame you won't survive to witness our victory.
Except, no, she didn't. She has literally not talked to the player or Bolvar or Jaina or Thrall one single time this entire expansion. Not once. She has literally only talked to Anduin.
It's so odd. It is so odd, that sort of disconnect between. I would always say that the main story is wanting. And the thing is that they could easily fill it in with, like you said, area zones. Like, continue telling that story.
They need characters that don't just tie to one zone or one subsection of a zone. They need a main character or a main cast of characters that continue across multiple zones, across the entirety of the story experience. Not to draw on the obvious parallel. I think I've mostly refrained from it this entire talk, but Final Fantasy XIV. has the Scions. The Scions are the main protagonists. Throughout any given expansion, be it Heavensward or Stormblood, Shadowbringers, Endwalker, you have 3 or 4, sometimes 5 or 6 main core characters. And those characters, even if they're introduced in a later zone, once they are introduced, they are a part of the core cast and stick with us through things. We see their reactions to different pieces of the plot that inform us of their perspective, inform us of a different way of approaching a given piece of story. And alongside that, all of those expansions also have a consistent antagonist. In Stormblood, it was Xenos, but in the most relevant one, Shadowbringers, it was Emmett Silk, who, for people who don't know Final Fantasy XIV, is probably one of the greatest video game villains of all time. In part because Emmett Silk is with you every step of the way. He is the villain of the expansion, undoubtedly. Not for 1 second are they going with this idea of, oh, actually, Emmett Silk's the good guy. No. Every time he brings up a valid point, every time he tries to convince us of someone, Thancred juts in and goes, hey, bitch, you're an Ascian. Suck my dick.
And that exactly, there's always someone to engage with their villain. The villain isn't some sort of far removed idea, because I feel like quite often that, the jailer and even Sylvanas' role within Shadowlands was more of a concept than the actual delivery.
I think in a lot of ways, it's a concept for Anduin to engage in. It is not a concept for us to engage in that what makes Emmett Silk work so well in Shadowbringers is he is not just a cut to another location where Emmett Silk is monologuing about something. He is there during our gameplay. He shows up after important plot beats. He is there in the game. We can idly talk to him. We can have more interactions with him than just the big cinematic lines. He is there with us the whole way through our gaming experience.
He narrates an entire dungeon.
Welcome to the final days of Amarant.
He is a part of our gameplay experience as a player. He is our antagonist. Whereas Sylvanas is Anduin's antagonist, and Anduin's antagonist alone, solely in those cinematics.
And it is so isolated, like the interactions. Like we're saying that Sylvanas is Anduin's antagonist for all of that. But I think they even struggle, they struggle as foils. And going back to what we were talking about ages and ages ago, about there is an opportunity to make Sylvanas Anduin's foil. And I feel like the removal of people, making sure that Rathian wasn't really in the story and so many other characters aren't in this story, and it's Sylvanas and Anduin. It's Sylvanas and Anduin.
Well, that's the thing, you can tell a story with that because characters don't need to just have one foil. And if you want to put this extreme idea of Anduin isolated in literal hell with only this one person to talk to, of course that person would be their foil. That is the only person he can bounce off of narratively.
Yes, exactly. But I still think they failed at it.
And they still didn't really.
They still failed. They still failed so miserably at it. Again, it's the isolation. It's the, see, guys, there's a cutscene. Don't you understand it?
I think it ties back a lot to a lot of the ideas that we've talked about of proactive versus reactive characters, where if they wanted Sylvanas to be anyone's foil, she should have been our foil. She should have been someone present like Emmett Silk was throughout the entirety of leveling, trying to convince us, trying to convince the mortals of the Shadowlands of the folly of this system. She can still have her enough and she gets away. She can have her moments of hey, maybe we're put into a situation where we can't attack her. Hey, maybe she shows up to Denathrius' court. And Denathrius is very clearly this extremely powerful dude. We can't just attack people willy-nilly under him. So she shows up, maybe use that whole Revendreth gown she has from Hearthstone that they made art for no reason. Have her show up as she is a representative of someone else. Maybe she wants to go under the pretense of not revealing Zoval yet, because Denathrius might know that she's in league with him, but we don't, and he's trying to keep that under wraps. So she's kind of showing up to make good on his progress, make sure things are going according to plan. And amidst this court setting, we're forced not to fight her, but have a conversation with her. We literally have to do a little stay a while and listen with the villain of the expansion. That's such a good moment, because ultimately the person who she is talking to about the idea of the futility of the system, of dismantling the system, is us. We are the active participant who is actually exploring the Shadowlands. We are seeing the injustices of the Kyrian and their memory wiping. We are seeing the injustices of the Maldraxi and their horrible win or die system. We are seeing the injustices of Ardenweald and how they're willing to sacrifice this wild god, not this horribly amoral wild god. We're seeing the injustices of Revendreth, where they are very clearly indulged in their own sin while purporting sins onto others. Over the course of the fulfilling are seeing the injustice of the system, but nobody is pointing them out to us. Sylvanas could have very easily been that person for us, the player, given us a very intimate relationship with the villain, so that when she has this fall from grace, we can see her come out of that. But instead, she espouses these things in very vague detail to Anduin, who at this point has literally only seen the Maw. He has not seen any of the injustices. He is being told about it secondhand, not even directly. Sylvanas never mentions the actual bad things to Anduin.
No, Pot, she did off screen.
Oh.
She did it off screen, okay? Like, she did the whole rundown and then tortured him a bit. We just didn't see any of that, okay?
This is like something that I really feel like they dropped the ball on, and what was kind of bugging me as I read the Sylvanas novel, it was like rekindling these annoyances. So you get to the Sylvanas novel, and the main plot, the framing device hinges on Sylvanas attempting to persuade Anduin to join her cause by telling her life story. But that's not the way to persuade Anduin. Like, why is she not utilizing Anduin's life story against him? Like, what happened to Anduin's mother? What if she was taken to what if she was taken to Revendreth? What if she had been tortured like all that time? Something like that.
What if she was deemed a threat? What if somewhere in her history, the Arbiter went, this soul is too potent, and she got cast into the Maw? Even if it's not true, that's not true, obviously, but give that possibility to Anduin. Put that nagging thought into his head of, here is a very real, very relevant cosmic injustice to you.
Right, or Varian or Saurfang if Tiffin is too niche, you know, like Saurfang, what if he went directly into the Maw?
Well, this book is plenty time going niche. Let's talk about Lyrath Windrunner for an entire book.
Like you said, so if it would have been like Saurfang or Varian to be a more broad term, she never appeals to anything about Anduin. It's always herself. And like, real shit, does Anduin even care?
Actually, I do think it is important to delineate the Sylvanas book from what we got in game, because largely those are two very different narratives, because we did not get that narrative in spirit, even by implication in game. The furthest implication is Anduin going, we've had a lot of talks, but you still haven't convinced me. We don't ever hear what those talks were about beyond the one we got in the prior cinematic. Whereas the book gives an entirely different framing of how he's being convinced. The first cinematic goes from it is pretty much the closest you get to a personal attempt to appeal to Anduin, because she basically talks about how the line of Rin is doomed to die, how he is doomed to this legacy of service, to dying and passing on his legacy to another poor kid who has to die and pass that legacy on. And that's the moment in there that actually does get to Anduin a little bit. You can see that moment in the cinematic where he looks down solemnly. He is genuinely thinking about what she is saying.
Every cruel second spent delaying the inevitable in an endless war that you, like every Rin before you, will not survive. You know the truth.
But beyond that, she is largely talking about the bigger cosmic system. She's talking about the injustice of not being able to choose, the injustice of having everything planned out for you.
Nothing is fair. Not life, not death. So we're going to tear it all down.
She's talking in these very large-scale social justice concepts, not personal.
We're breaking a system that has always been flawed and remaking it into one that is just.
The thing that was always like kind of bugged me about her trying to persuade Anduin is I feel like realistically he would have been persuaded a little bit by her cause if she had gone into the injustices of the Shadowland. That very much seems like something that he would be persuaded by. Like, you know, no, I don't think that people should suffer for eternity in the Maw, being tortured, like separated from their loved ones.
And I love torture in the war, actually.
Yeah, he's like, no, this is good. This is the way of things.
I mean, if everyone else is just stuck in the bubble doing nothing, it can't be that bad.
This is like kind of a tangent, but I feel like the torture in Shadowlands is very very hypothetical, and it's like one of the ways in which we don't really see the consequences of the Maw. Things are just kind of talked about vaguely, like, oh, we hear Jaina and Thrall screaming, but we don't really, well, we sort of get into like Jaina being burned alive and things like that, but it's like, what torture is she doing to Anduin? Like, it's not concrete. He doesn't even seem that affected by it.
There are these like little things on the gameplay, like, oh, you find a chain infused with light that Anduin escaped from. You find a lion sigil from his armor that got scratched off, and it's clearly a sign of armor damage. There's the implications that Anduin is being tortured. But then we get to the cinematic, and he is not only not tortured, he's almost bored.
Right, he's bored.
He's like sitting there because nothing has happened to him. He's just been waiting for Sylvanas to show up.
There she is again. You know, these endless lectures of yours.
He has no enrichment in his life, so he's just wasting away.
He has no enrichment in his torture zone. He's like, hey, I thought there was torture going to be going on here. And they're like, no, shut up. And he's like, all right.
It's one of those things also that they don't really touch on in-game because WoW was so weird with its timeline, but according to the timeline they set out, Anduin was in Torghast for a full year.
Oh my god.
Doing what?
So he's literally, like, if you want to call it torture, a full year of literally no one except Sylvanas recounting her life story to him.
That's actually, you know what? They're right. I would have suffered too. They were right. This is torture no man should suffer. My lord.
There was that one comic on Twitter I need to find. If Anduin was there for a full year, that means he had to have celebrated his birthday, which means Sylvanas probably celebrated his birthday with him. I found it. You have to put this in the video. With proper credit, of course.
Oh my god, I love that. You haven't touched your Maw rat cake. The face.
Is it made out of cake, one might ask, or is it just a Maw rat with icing on it?
No, it's literally just a Maw rat with icing, and her arrow's on fire.
And they never even showed Anduin, like, suffer, like, even before he got turned into, like, Shadow Maw and, chained, dominated king form. Black eye, short hair. He just seems annoyed. He just seems like pissed off.
He suffered in the emotional way. He suffers nobly, not physically, through the expression of his sadness, which is one of those same things of kind of the same issues with BFA, where Anduin is not taking any action. He is not suffering anything notable. He is just really, really sad about stuff. The biggest injury he has is bonking his head on the shield when he tries to step over to Sylvanas.
And what purpose would that serve?
It really is. Again, it compounds that thing of, like, you can see that Anduin is suffering because he's sad.
Even when we touch on him becoming dominated, what happens when he finally gets free? Do we see a lasting impact on Anduin visually?
No.
Or does it literally melt away like a magic glamour? And not only does he have his perfect armor back, he magically regrows his hair into a nice, neat ponytail.
I can understand the limitations with the models in regards to that, but really, couldn't they just, like, change his head model in that horrible armor?
Sylvanas got like 3 different models in Shadowlands alone, so I feel like they could have put some resources towards that.
They even literally just randomly threw in a Thrall model in the middle of the patch for no reason. He just gets a new model, puts back the Doom plate on just because.
Yeah.
And like, even on the idea of like changing the faces, when you look at Sylvanas's like Shattered Legacy's Soul cinematic, they use BFA Sylvanas, like her War Chief armor. But if you look at the face, they use her Shadowlands face model. They literally cut out the old Legion one and put in her new one, because logically, you want to edit the model. So they are clearly capable of editing those models. When we cut to the game, it's still regular old Anduin. Sure, you can say it's still regular old Anduin there. In the same way, when Sylvanas got the scar on her face, when we cut to the Ghostlands and the Loyalist ending, she didn't have the scar on her face because they didn't have that model ready yet. But they could easily do that in the cinematics in the same way they gave Anduin a unique cloak, unique combination of his armor for the final cinematic in Shadowlands.
Even just like a little bit, like a scratch on the face, like, the eyebrow cut that he has for War Within. Couldn't they have given him that, or at least dirt?
Literally, I think bare minimum, keep his blonde, keep his face as it is, take away the DK stuff, just keep the fuck ass bob. Like, it's literally just Sylvanas fucked up his hair And even if you take away the maw corruption, taking away the maw corruption isn't going to unfuck his hair. And hey, now you have a really obvious reason for why he might cut it, because he literally got given the fuck-ass Bob Arthas hairstyle by Sylvanas.
Whoa, fuck ass Bob beyond you. And Anduin's like, no, please, Sylvanas, anything but that. She's like, just has a pair of shears and he's just cutting his hair.
I still think they should have just had him go prematurely gray. I'm still sticking my ground on this. I know they did that with Jaina, but
On one hand, I agree, but on the other, they did it with Arthas, they did it with Jaina. It's a very tried and true trope to have the blonde, blue-eyed, noble character turn white-haired as they gain trauma.
oh, what's one more repeated trope?
Syl's like this, god damn it, I want another silver-haired boy.
On a personal level, I am kind of glad they didn't do it, because then maybe one day Anduin can escape the Arthas parallels and not have that permanent Arthas parallel on him.
True.
Yeah, instead he should get dark hair, he should go brunette.
Well, he basically is. He is going through the life cycle of a dirty blonde. He's not blonde anymore. He's a dirty blonde. That's what I have too. When I was Anduin's age, when I was 17, I was bright blonde, as clear as day. And as I got into my 20s, my hair turned darker. It's still blonde. It still has those undertones, but it is a very dirty blonde. It is a very brownish blonde, especially when you cut it that short.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I'll give them points for accuracy then.
I've said that about Anduin's cinematic model in The War Within, of a lot of people go like, oh, he looks so old now. He looks so ragged. Anduin is the closest thing we have to a British white man, and that is how British white men age. That is how British white men look when they are 25.
He really does not look that old at all in the cinematic.
He literally just looks like he's sunburned and he has scars and he has dirt. He has the logical wrinkles that he already had at age 17. He looks closer to his in-game model than the perfect angel twink that we saw in the BFA model.
I like him with wrinkles. It's good. I've always said that. He already had a few wrinkles. Like I said, it's a natural progression of his looks, basically, here. 100% though, like, Anduin's looks in the War Within trailer, it's nice. He's supposed to be, what, like 26 now? 27?
25 or 26.
Yeah, 25 or 26. So yeah, it's absolutely normal, like, having those few extra, especially if he's been out in the desert bloody rolling around. How do people expect him to look?
He literally walked across an entire continent as a pasty white boy. Of course he's gonna look like it.
Men look like that in Australia after one afternoon Sunday cricket match. I hope people learn that.
I think that Shadowlands gives us the total opposite of Shadows Rising, where we just like don't see how Anduin is affected by what he's going through or the events around him at all. We don't see how he's affected physically and emotionally by the torture. We don't see an internal monologue of him kind of grappling with the things that Sylvanas is telling him.
I think this is also one of those moments of, this is a critique of Warcraft as a whole and not just Anduin. Of, I think at times some writers forget that this is not a novel medium. This is not a first or omniscient third-person medium where we can see inside people's heads and know their thoughts. Where one of the reasons the books work a lot of the time for expanding things is because we can see characters' thoughts. We can do a lot more complex things because we can see when a character says something that doesn't necessarily equate to what they're thinking in their head. That's a very big benefit of textual medium. Whereas WoW is very much the opposite extreme of, not only has it historically been a visual medium, it has historically solely been a dialogue medium, not a face acting medium, where one of the things, similarly, why it works in Final Fantasy XIV is because when a character says something, you can have the camera show their face and show they don't mean what they say. They have this regretful expression on their face, or they say something and then you pan to them doing the Arthur fist next to them and then clenching it and getting really, really mad because clearly they are trying to repress something in this moment because they have the benefit of that kind of technology. And up until Shadowlands, we largely did not have that for the vast majority of story content. The only things we had were voice acting and the text going along with that voice acting. And a lot of the time, it wasn't even voice acting. So WoW was historically a medium where you very much had to take things at face value. And I largely think that's one of the issues and the failures with Sylvanas' story is when you tell this story of, actually, Sylvanas was lying the whole time. She was faking her allegiance to the Forsaken, faking her allegiance to the Horde. She was serving the jailer the whole time. How are we supposed to know that? How are we supposed to pick up on that, even through implication of something is off with Sylvanas? When the story we get is in-game, her just saying things. And because prior to then, WoW knew how to take advantage of that. Because when they wanted to show X character is lying, X character doesn't have these actual feelings, it would do a scene like the finale of Gilneas for the Worgen, where you go and you spy on Sylvanas in the cathedral with one of the Worgen friends. You go in there, you see this meeting with her, one of Garrosh's generals, and one of her advisors. She's talking to this guy. He's like, Garrosh has explicitly forbidden use of the plague. You'd better not use it, Sylvanas. And she's like, of course I'm not using it. I'm using normal tactics because Garrosh told me to do that. And he's like, okay, good job. He walks away. And then she literally turns around and the Forsaken guy goes, so are we not using the plague? And she goes, of course we're using the plague, you idiot. And that's the way WoW did those clear moments of this character is lying, but we can't show that they're lying just through dialogue and just through characters doing /say animations. So to alleviate that, we have her immediately say after, I am lying.
Yeah, it's the Dune 2 method. It's like this mustache twirling evil bad guy. The lighting changes. Let's kill them.
Yeah, it's unsubtle, but it had to be unsubtle because that was the limitations of the medium. And as we've gotten more into these cinematics, I think WoW has largely forgotten that that is the basis of Warcraft, is not being a very subtle game and being profound through these characters very directly basically saying the theme, saying their intentions through a conversation. Like, that's what made Rathian so interesting, is we knew that Rathian was manipulating the factions. Rathian was manipulating things in the shadows because we were the one doing that for him. We got to see his perspective of him doing these manipulations, him doing these dark things. And then when it blew up in his face, it's not just a sudden reveal at the end. The reveal at the end is him flat out going, I was backing the Alliance. This was my thing all along. And when you look at the plot lines going back, he is very clearly backing the Alliance. He is very clearly doing storylines of undermining Garrosh, sparking this faction conflict further to make sure Garrosh gets more heat under his ass. It's not subtle. It is not something that comes out of nowhere. It is a direct thing Rathian does the entire expansion. Whereas when we get to a lot of these more modern things, I think the increasing reliance on books and the reliance on writers who are very proficient in doing internal monologue in books has led to a failure a lot of the times of realizing that we can't see these characters' thoughts in cinematics. Even in cinematics where we can very clearly see their face, a lot of the times it still feels like they're relying on the idea of actually we know their internal thoughts. And I think there's no better place than these Sylvanas Anduin cinematics, because the only place we learn Sylvanas' actual motivations is in a book. We don't learn that in game, but there's this clear implication of, oh, Sylvanas has this secret motivation. What is it? We don't find out until after the entire expansion.
It's so strange to me, again, like you're saying, Paul, is the writers are almost treating it like, well, we know what the secret is, but you'll just have to wait out and find out, which is obviously very highly unsatisfying in a sense of this. It's very odd that the writers don't take a sense of treating this like theatre, the writing that you need for theatre, which is very expressive and very emotive, but it's all on stage.
WoW is very much theater because in a lot of ways, like theater, we're not close enough to the people to see their faces, to see the details of them. Things need to be very obvious and very exaggerated to get the point across, because that is the medium on which WoW was founded.
And it would help them a lot if they actually considered like writing the cutscenes and the actual dialogue that came after very much in that theatrical sort of sense of, like I said, actual staged theatre, not just like movie script. We're not writing it like the Avengers as much as the devs would like us to think about that, but actual theatre. Make it a bit melodramatic, but it conveys the point well, essentially. And like I said, it also makes up for those things that a lot of other media has under its belt, like inner thoughts or nuance or the ability to really zoom in on, like, you can do it in a cutscene, but you can't do it in the parts later on. Like you said, zoom in on the Arthur fist of it shaking, like this person's holding back. Make it that extra bit dramatic. And right from I'm going to write a stage play in regards to this main story, because at least that allows the characters to voice a... No one's turning their nose up on a good bit of Shakespeare.
If we want another example of this, it is, as we've talked upon plenty, Rathian in 10.1. where in his short story, we see into his head. We see a very clear idea of he is putting on a facade. He is putting on a persona to hide his insecurities. And even in stuff like the Waking Shore stuff, we see this moment when he's talking to Alex Strauss of him getting this moment of disgust and then hiding it with this veiled niceness of like saying a snide comment with a smile, and then he walks away, and it very clearly reveals he is angry. He is mad as he's walking away.
Stay then. Tend to what matters most to your flight, and I will save what matters most to mine.
That's like a way of translating that very obvious style of writing into the visual format. That's a good way of doing it, but 10.1 does that much less so because A, Wrathion is not really in those big cinematics as much at all. It's mostly Ebonhorn, and it's Abyssian, and it's Emberthal. He mostly just shows up with his janky in-game Blood Elf model and does hand flap, and we rely just on his voice acting. And just on his voice acting, he's putting on this very boisterous thing, and no one in the story goes, hey, he's putting on this act, but he's hiding vulnerability. So to the audience, all you see is this arrogant, boisterous, tone-deaf person being arrogant and boisterous and tone-deaf, and that's all the story tells you. It doesn't tell you what he's hiding. And so coming from that story, so much of the fandom has gone with this idea of Wrathion was unworthy to be Asik because he's angry and boisterous, and he's tone-deaf, and he's not good in these situations, and not anything about his insecurities, anything about why he is doing that. And I think that applies equally to a lot of the stuff in Anduin's arc, where there is clearly the potential for Anduin outwardly expressing these ideas of opposing Sylvanas, of sticking firm to his ideas of justice, but internally having these moments of doubt. But the only one we really get of that is that briefest moment where we touch on Varian. Other than that, Anduin in the game cinematics is wholly steadfast. He shows no signs of crack, and it's just he refuses Sylvanas, and that's that. And because of his utter refusal, his utter inability to step down from his moral pedestal, she is forced to dominate him.
I was going to say I 100% agree, but there are like two really tiny moments where I think they do kind of reveal Anduin's internal struggle a bit. We just didn't get as much of them. The first one is in that, I think the first cinematic between him and Sylvanas in Torghast where he's still chained up. When Sylvanas opens the door, there's this loud banging noise and he flinches and he like slowly looks up like cautiously. And I think that like the one instance where we see the torture having an effect on him is that he's flinching at the sound of a door opening, of someone approaching him, entering his cell, because that's going to mean more pain for him.
I thought that moment was just him being shocked that someone was entering his room because he'd just been chained up there.
Oh, okay. This could just be me like extrapolating.
The story there basically goes with the idea that Anduin had just been sitting there. Because in the earlier stories, Sylvanas talks to the jailer and basically goes, don't dominate him, don't torture him, don't do what you're going to do to all the others. Let me convince him. There's like a whole cutscene where you're sneaking through Torghast as the player. You eavesdrop on this conversation. So the context there very much is Anduin has not been touched. Anduin is being left unspoiled by the jailer intentionally because Sylvanas is revealing her kind of small bits of sympathy for him, her reasons of like wanting to convince him.
Okay.
How long has he been by himself down there, though? Has this man been down there for months already? Because how does this bloody timeline work?
I think the timeline is supposed to be like the base story happens over the course of not a lot of time, and that story is a part of the base expansion story, and then the max level stuff happens over the course of a few months.
Okay, I redact what I said then.
From that moment to the one where he actually gets dominated, that is probably months, and you can see his kind of tiredness about her lectures in that second one.
There she is again.
I'm going to say this, though, so don't disregard what you're saying here, though. You can see, again, the lack in the storytelling that you need to be like, okay, so I need to have this and I need to extrapolate from this one tiny thing, you know, that it's got to be this in regards to that. Why not have that cutscene just to have Sylvanas, what are you doing? Are you behind like this? Free me. You know, I've been down here all by myself. Just obviously better words.
It's also inconsistent in that the quest prior has all the moments like Anduin with these tied up chains he's escaping from, or the knocked off lion pendant, or the ring he lost. Of like that gameplay quest, some gameplay designer clearly thought he was being tortured. So the lead up to that does have this implication of yes, Anduin is being tortured. But the cinematics team did not have that idea. For the cinematics, which are the relevant narrative, he is not. But as a player, it's very logical you would think he was being tortured. He might have that flinching response because the gameplay team did think that.
This is another thing, again, and this really, I think, really showed in Dragonflight too, the disconnect between the gameplay team and the actual quest team and how they separate quests into different groups of writers. And then you got also the guys who are writing the cutscenes.
Seems like they don't inform each other. They sit in two different rooms and don't talk to each other.
It's a long-running joke about WoW's writing for that, but I do think it's coming to a head now that I actually do think they don't talk to each other about this.
Now that we're getting stuff that is a lot more integrated, a lot of stuff that is a lot more like, these are not just random cuts to a scene like the Wrathgate, which is very scarce, or moments in various raids at the end of like, there's a clear delineation of, okay, you are told how this cinematic starts, get us to that point. Which like, with those, you can see some of those narratives break in Shadowlands too, because another rant about Sylvanas, how in her fight, she's espousing all these ideological things. She's talking to these characters about like, oh, she's very clearly being petty in her fight. She is like, you guys refuse to see what I am trying to tell you. Fine. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to make you suffer. Rue, you guys, you're still fighting against me. Suffer for it. I'm drawing this out. She's sending Mossworn to torture Thrall and Jaina on the bridge. She's doing all these terrible things. She's warding us off against the jailer and reveling in our agony. And then once it gets to 50% and the fight ends, it cuts to the cinematic, and suddenly she's all like, we have what we need, Zoval. We can just leave. Don't stay behind and torture them. That's bad.
The way is open, Zoval! We already have what we need!
Her big turning point is the fact that the jailer is petty and spiteful and not doing this for a sense of justice. He is very clearly doing this out of personal spite. He is dominating them just because he can. He's making them suffer just because he can.
Too long I endured the Maker's flawed design. I will forge a new reality where all shall serve.
That makes sense for cinematic Sylvanas, the one who, over the course of this expansion, has been saving Anduin from torture, trying to espouse these ideas of justice to him, trying to show him the necessity of doing these things, of these evil things are for a purpose, not just because I want to. In-game Sylvanas is not that, because they clearly didn't communicate that in-game Sylvanas and cinematic Sylvanas should be the same thing, because they're the same character.
Again, it's that disconnect. They really need to start focusing on reducing that. And again, I still always think about that quote from Yoshi P. I know, bringing up Final Fantasy XIV again, where it said that he sits down and he plays through what they've done very close to obviously getting to Alpha, and he lets the team know if it's all consistent. Like, he plays it from start to finish, no one bothers him. He does everything in the main scenario quests, because that's obviously the selling point of their expansions, right? The main story, the leveling experience, the main story, and then finally getting to max level. And it's like, okay, cool, I've done with everything, but I want to finish that story. Plays from start to finish. I feel like no one does that in World of Warcraft, because I don't think anyone, after the base sort of game of an expansion is done in World of Warcraft, sits there and plays it all through from start to finish and goes, okay, cool, that was really nice and smooth. And then does that for each consecutive patch after that. Goes, okay, so I was the guy who played through all the base game and I can see where the story's going. I made my notes and like, these are the consistencies and this is a reasonable place that the plot should go, and then plays through the patch, before it goes into like beta testing and goes, okay, that's pretty consistent. I can see how it connects to like the base game and like how it continues this story on. I don't think think anyone's checking that because we've talked with 10.1 as another bad example. We saw the quality consistency between each of the chapters in that. I think they cut it down a little bit for 10.2, but I think they got away with that because it wasn't so much character focused in 10. I know that sounds a bit weird, but because they could focus on a different character for every other chapter, like one for Vyranoth, one for Marithra, and let's be honest, Marithra doesn't have a character to ruin. And just like you spend one chapter with Tyrande and learning about like the Druids of the Flame, it worked a lot better because it was just the barest ties between each one of those chapters. But take 10.1, which was supposed to be consistent story with the same characters, and the inconsistency between character writing in each one of those, then with the cutscenes, like spending a whole cutscene of just Farak coming in and roasting the bloody Nifin, I'd actually argue that they wasted resources on that cutscene. Like, you can just imply that Farak flew over and set something on fire rather than showing it.
Or at least just do it as one of the in-game ones, because it's such a dramatic moment for what is essentially emotionless Nifin, who don't really have a lot of facial expression, staring solemnly. I get it, because in the moment, it is a very good build-up of, like, you meet these characters, they're cute characters, and then this guy very suddenly dies, and this character that was up until this point a very chipper, nice grandma is struck with grief, and her line is just like, don't be sorry, be angry. And that's a very powerful moment at the end there.
Brian, you should have sought cover instead of worrying about me. You were so young.
I am so sorry, Elder.
That beast, the one that smelled like death and sulfur. You kill it for brine sauce, you hear?
And that could have been a very good moment if those characters had literally ever shown up after that moment.
It's the consistency again. Turning this back so I don't get too off topic. Back to Anduin and Sylvanas' interactions and their work as foils with each other, and then the inconsistency of like the actual story writing, because I would actually argue that the actual quests within Shadowlands, Anduin isn't even there, I would say.
No. He shows up in questing for the Maw intro for about half of it, and then obviously we get his dramatic sacrifice there.
Go, champion! Go!
You have failed.
And then from there, we don't see him at all in the rest of the base game in gameplay. The only times we see him are in the two cinematics at the start and end of the Torghast story. He is the big cliffhanger at the end of 9.0 of Anduin is going to be dominated. What's going to happen there? What choice will Sylvanas make?
I've not come this far to falter now.
Then why do you hesitate? Make your choice. Sylvanas Windrunner.
And he is pretty much one of the main characters of the expansion. He's a really defining character, and we see him 3 times.
I wouldn't even blame Anduin's character and the issues of writing Anduin's character in Shadowlands. It was just a weird sort of vacuum, that expansion. It was so little happening.
I would blame him less if not for the issues continue on from BFA, because like we've talked about, I think that Shadowlands is very much the apex of Anduin being the moral arbiter of the franchise, in that Anduin is the character not only that people aspire to, but that his mere presence and his sheer goodness is so strong that the people who have committed literal genocide start to doubt themselves by their confrontation against him. Like Sylvanas sitting in front of someone who is the spitting image of herself, literally wearing her exact outfit, but Night Elven, right in the middle of her taking her undead army through Night Elven lands, coming to destroy their capital city. There is this dying ranger in front of her.
Why? You've already won. Only innocents remain in the tree.
Do you think she has a moment of, wait, this really parallels me. This really parallels my experiences. What am I doing? That would be a really logical moment for her to have that. Instead, in that moment, she has a moment where she says in her head, Arthas was right, and decides to burn the tree.
You can kill us, but you cannot kill hope.
Can't I?
Whereas when she is confronted with Anduin, Anduin is what reminds her of herself. Anduin's inherent goodness is so good that she is reminded of what happens to her, which logically she should be. She should be reminded there. She is about to dominate Anduin in the same way she was dominated.
Join our cause, or be made to serve.
What kind of choice is that? Why even give me? It's the choice you never had. Despite all your grand designs, there's still some shred of your mortality haunting you. As if the Banshee Queen hasn't entirely eclipsed the Ranger General.
Don't.
But why now? It's not bad for Sylvanas to do it then. It's bad this is the first time she is having that, because no character up to this point has been able to convince her of this until Anduin, who, like we saw in BFA with Saurfang, he was the only one who could convince Saurfang. It wasn't the Horde that convinced Saurfang. It wasn't Rokon or Thalyssra, the good in the Horde, old and new. It was Anduin, the human king, and all his goodness that was able to convince Saurfang.
I can't. Not alone.
And now we see that again with Sylvanas, where fitting image for herself, her own people, the people of the Horde, none of them were able to convince Sylvanas to stray from her path, but Anduin is. It is Anduin's goodness and Anduin's suffering that convinces her. It is there that we see the cracks in her morality.
Reality. We have all
And obviously, this is a consequence of BFA was not written with Sylvanas as a character. BFA was written with Sylvanas as mustache twirling generic evil war chief.
Burn it!
And so they had to kind of course correct of how do we find a way to pull Sylvanas back from that ledge. Anduin is a good candidate for that in a lot of ways, but to have it be just them flat out saying Anduin is getting done to him what was done to you, and her going, oh wow, I never realized that, it makes Sylvanas really dumb. And that's really one of the issues in Shadowlands, is Sylvanas was made so dumb.
I will never serve.
She should be one of the smartest characters in the setting, and she is just like, can't see anything in front of her because she needs Anduin to make her realize that. That's compounded in the book, where she literally says at the end, as she's walking out in furious rage, after Anduin goes, this was never about me. This was always about Lyrath and you. This was about you trying to get back what you lost. She basically goes at the end, when she's in the maw, of like, Anduin had seen what she never could. Anduin saw through her real emotions of, it was not her that figured it out, it was Anduin that figured it out. And that ties, I think, into the general stuff of the Sylvanas book, because Anduin is, to put it nicely, a complete asshole. He is really, really terrible in the Sylvanas book, but he is not intentionally an asshole. In Shadows Rising, Anduin is also kind of an asshole. But the difference is, in Shadows Rising, it is going, wow, Anduin is being an asshole. He is under a lot of stress. All of these situations are making him become a worse person. Sylvanas and the hunt for Sylvanas is making him become like that. Jaina notes that. She goes, wow, this is not the Anduin I know. Something is wrong. Whereas in this book, this is just treated as default Anduin. This is treated as Anduin as good and moral and able to see through the lies of Sylvanas' facade and strike at the truth of things. And how he does that in a few assorted moments is he says that Sylvanas, the woman who was murdered, raised into slavery, and had her body abused, is privileged compared to Anduin because at least she had a childhood first. Keep in mind, Anduin, yes, Anduin had troubles in his childhood. Anduin had issues when Varian returned. He was kidnapped by Nixia. Obviously, these things are bad to have in a childhood. But Anduin had a very happy relationship with his father before he got kidnapped. He was not brought his entire life. It is very explicit that Anduin and Varian, despite the loss of Tiffin, had a very good relationship, and Anduin was very much sheltered from any of Varian's woes. And then subsequently after that, Anduin was sheltered. Even though Varian was kind of annoying about it for Anduin, Anduin was sheltered from it. He was kept in Stormwind. He had to sneak out. He had to get his way into situations where he didn't belong. All of the situations in Anduin's youth in which he struggled, in which he suffered, were his choices. It was not a result of his childhood. It was not a result of his fraught relationship with his father.
Even with, like, as we discussed earlier too, like, even with the worst times with Varian, it still doesn't hold a candle to Sylvanas, like, even slightly. Like, the things that Sylvanas has, like, experienced in her long life eclipse anything that Anduin could even slightly relate to, you know?
Again, what we've talked about is Anduin has largely been spared of any kind of physical suffering. And like that's not to say emotional suffering is less significant. Emotional suffering is obviously very significant, but Sylvanas literally got murdered, raised from the dead, forcibly enslaved, and made to murder civilians en masse using her uncontrollable voice. Like literally in this book, he gets described in detail how she literally, her cries of pain were forcing her to burst the eardrums of innocent civilians in front of her. How she was literally forced and constantly reminded of her dead brother amidst destroying civilians en masse. And you're saying that your bad relationship with your dad is equivalent to that or worse? There's not even a moment of like Sylvanas going, wow, that's kind of rude, Anduin. That's really fucking tone deaf, Anduin. And like, or at least Sylvanas going like, I would call him out, but he's understandably stressed right now because I have him in literal hell. You could have Sylvanas go, no, it makes sense why Anduin's being standoffish, why he's being a bit rude, because I have him in a terrible situation. Because she has a lot of moments in the book where she's like, if I were in these people's situations, I would be like that too. She has these moments where Sylvanas can clearly be understanding. But in this moment, it's just framed as, no, Anduin is normal, and this is just Anduin saying this.
He's totally within his right to say this, and he kind of makes a good point. It's so bizarre. This was a really good chance for Sylvanas to be like, hey, what the fuck? Like, worry that she's lost a chance of, like, convincing Anduin if she lashes out at Anduin and says, oh, don't give me that, you fucking, stupid ass little man king, like, shut up, man thing, I'm bawling. Literally, like, lay into Anduin until he's sort of recoiling, and then Sylvanas going, oh, that isn't winning me any favor. I just, like, laid into him because he's being an idiot, Like, that was a good chance of that in the book, but they still can't even frame Anduin as saying the wrong thing even with that.
I was going to say, I think the Sylvanas novel is like the opposite from Shadow's Rising approach, and that's the Sylvanas novel puts Anduin on a pedestal or tries to.
Here is a literal line from it after Anduin said all those things to Sylvanas, of Sylvanas saying in her head, this was not the petulant cry of a child, but the just fury of what the world would see as a good man. It is very explicitly framed as Anduin is just and good, and people rightfully see him as noble.
I want to slap his head so hard that, like, he gets concussed. Seriously, how that is even rationalized in that story, it's like night and day to Shadows Rising, honestly. Anduin, like, considers things, and, like, his perspective is, like, metered by his own thing. It isn't like, but the Sylvanas book with Anduin, like I said, we're not going to really talk about the Sylvanas bits. The early Sylvanas bits are very, very solid, but as soon as Anduin enters the picture, it's like the Anduin writing is shocking in that book. I actually say that the Sylvanas book increased the amount of people saying, hey, what's wrong with this character on social media and just like Twitter and stuff like that, because of how unjudgmental the book's viewpoint was of him acting like this. Like, the genuine, like, response to this is, how fucking dare he? But the book treats it like how just and right Anduin is. It is bizarre, and people notably pointed out how bizarre it was.
The book, Sylvanas, I think, tries to portray him as the moral center of quote unquote the universe, the Warcraft universe, when that's clearly, like, from a meta point of view, that's like not who he is at all.
It portrays him as so good that he is able to just pierce through everyone's hypocrisy, everyone's facades, everyone's little insecurities, and note exactly what's really true about it. And rather than going, wow, Anduin, taking these really sensitive subjects and reducing them down to these moral things is kind of a dick move. It goes, no, actually, he's totally right. And he's so insightful for being right about that.
This is such a fucking contrast from everything from Legion and earlier and Shadows Rising. Like, we've compounded. It was like this bizarre shift on how Anduin was viewed as like a franchise leading character from BFA and beyond. And like I said, it's not been good for his character, because the thing is, all the complexities are still there for his character, but framing him in this manner does him such a disservice, and it creates like an antagonism, I feel, that we feel towards his character when he does this shit. And it'd be fine if he was doing this, right? If he was saying these things like, Sylvanas, you haven't had it half as bad as me, at least you had a childhood. My dad was mean to me he wants. Like, if Sylvanas went off her fucking shit at Anduin there and be like, how fucking dare you? How narrow-minded and how dumb do you gotta be?
Well, she does do that logically at a later point, thankfully, but it's still not necessarily framed as him being wrong so much as her having an outburst, because about 75 way through the book, she reveals that she killed herself at Ice Crown Citadel. Like, he was like, I had no idea you tried that. She's like, I didn't just try, I succeeded in that. And he retorts with, but you were wrong. And throughout this interlude, he basically tells her all the reasons she did have to live, all the reasons why she selfishly killed herself in that moment and ignored all the people who loved her.
This is where we pick Anduin up and we fucking reverse bloody power drive him into the ground so hard that his head pops like a watermelon.
Yeah, I just like don't have the words. Like, I can't fully process just how awful that is.
He asked why you would do that. And she basically says that without Arthas, without getting that kill on Arthas, she had lost her purpose. Because that's what she defined herself by. And he basically goes, so you just wanted him to suffer. And it's like, okay, yeah. Okay.
No shit!
With the program, Anduin, come on.
Anduin saying these things is a-okay, but how they're framed as the right thing to say is so tone deaf. So tone deaf.
The next line is literally her going, the boy was baiting her, being deliberately obtuse. Either that or he was a shockingly brilliant advocate. And after that, he chastises her for abandoning the Forsaken, who were devoted for her. He chastises her for abandoning Nathanos and judges her for not sparing him a thought and selfishly dying instead. He chastises her for not reaching out to her sisters. And obviously Sylvanas silences him there because he's being really fucking rude. She's not doing it from a perspective of like, he's being a fucking asshole. She's doing it from the idea of he just doesn't understand. He just doesn't get why she did this.
Yeah, and like this, so has Sylvanas not studied Anduin's past? Like, can't she say this about so many people that Anduin's done in his life dirty like this? Like, okay, you haven't reached out to your sisters. Okay, well, you haven't reached out to Rathian. Everything that he's saying there, Anduin has done himself. But it's like playing like, no, only Sylvanas has done this. Anduin is like, has never done this before in his entire life, and he knows this is getting under Sylvanas' skin. Anduin's being a little hypocrite here. Sylvanas could easily dismantle him piece by piece. Like, she could do fucking Uno reverse on this guy's ass. Like, it's handing Sylvanas the idiot ball. Like, this plot will only work if you're as dumb as fuck.
It literally does, because in the subsequent interlude after all of it, so she tells him about meeting the jailer, about all the things that kind of lined up with the jailer's philosophy. And he is the one like, oh, I understand. And she's like, you do? And he's like, she's very shocked and relieved, like, oh, he finally understands after I told him. And he's like, oh, I understand why you would believe him. He is all like, oh, I understand. And she's relieved and she is shocked, like he like understands this. And he's like, oh, I understand why you would believe him after all you were shown. He gave you hope.
You can kill us, but you cannot kill hope.
Now I understand why you brought me here. Why you've tried so hard to persuade me. Because if you can get me to let go of hope, you finally can too.
Enough!
Anduin is such a fucking dickhead in this book. I can't believe it. And how it's framed as like, Anduin's so right. Dear Lord, any sort of opposition in this book towards Anduin, even the slightest bit of pressure against his character, would explode him. Would explode him. He would be dead.
Even in this very moment, she's going like, okay, you just think I'm an idiot. You think I'm a fool for believing him. And even in that, it can't just be, oh, Anduin is being patronizing. It has to be, oh, I don't think you a fool. I might have made the same choices. I think the jailer has just perfected his persuasion for eternity. I'm not falling for it, but I understand why you did.
It's like, all right, Anduin, okay. Sure you would.
By you did, because you're so dumb, Sylvanas. Oh, that passive aggressiveness is so unpleasant. And like I said, if someone actually called him out in this and said you're being an unpleasant fucking nasty boy, and he's like, well, because I'm being like captured here. But there's no point in this story where Sylvanas makes Anduin cringe and like starts breaking away at his resolve. Like she's like, all right, no more Mrs. Nice fucking Banshee. Let's go at you. Hey, let's go at you. Right? And then turns the table on him and deconstructs him, because this is a perfect time to like take him apart piece by piece and see how he isn't a good leader, how he's abandoned people in his life, how he's petty, how he falls for stuff. Like with Garrosh, always thinking Garrosh is going to change. How much of a a naive idiot do you gotta be for that? Like, Sylvanas could take him apart at this point, but the book never allows it because it's like the book runs on the default that is right. And he is the moral center.
After he's going for this moment of like, oh, I don't think you're dumb. I think you're brilliant. I think you're just blinded by being in it. And she has this moment like, oh, doubt creeps into her mind because maybe he's right. And it's like, he's asking this moment like, okay, why am I so important? Why am I the person you need to sway Sylvanas? And then that leads into her like having this moment like, oh, I think I know, but I can't speak the words. And that subsequently leads to the final interlude, which is the revelation at Anduin's hand that actually it wasn't about Anduin at all. It was about Lyrath. And Anduin was just her projecting Lyrath onto Anduin because he reminds her of him so much.
You know,
Oh, I think we lost Sam. I just find like the entire premise of the Sylvanas novel, or at least the framing device, just very flimsy. I just do not buy that this 19-20-year-old human would be wise enough to
The point of him is that he's supposed to be wise beyond his years. That's a big point of him, but it's like it's so shrewd, it's so calculatingly perfect in how to deconstruct Sylvanas that like he gets her so doubtful, so riled up, so willing to divulge so much stuff. It's like, yeah, you're saying she's not an idiot. You're verbally insisting she's brilliant, but you're treating her like she's an idiot. You're treating her so patronizingly.
And in some cases, she is kind of acting dumb. It's just like a very flimsy premise.
It's this thing of like, oh, Anduin is so insightful and so smart that even she couldn't see it with all her years.
I don't think that that's like impossible to achieve with Anduin and Sylvanas.
It needed to be a situation that wasn't literally the most obvious deception ever.
The fact that the jailer's plan is just like very obvious, like he's very obviously bad news from the start.
It's one of those things where they had to do so much of like, this guy is so obviously not only evil, but the guy behind Sylvanas' suffering, that they had to go out of the way to do the like, oh, Arthas was right all along. Actually, he was justified. He was just small scale. I need to go big scale. And it's like they had to write so many things that deconstruct her character far worse than if they didn't explain this stuff. And it's through this lens of Anduin being able to pick her apart, Anduin having such this high level of insightful morality that he is able to just pluck everything out of her and get to the root of all the real issues in her life, which, like we've mentioned a lot earlier, once again has nothing to do with Anduin and just this character's personal trauma being applied to him because of his superficial traits.
I think that if they were going to do something like that, like if they were going to have Anduin like outwit her or dig into some vulnerability that she accidentally exposes while trying to persuade him and telling him her life story or whatever, they needed to like restrain themselves, because I feel like a moment like that happens like in almost every single interlude where Anduin like says something and it gets at Sylvanas, or she's like tricked by him or something like that. I don't know how to describe it. They just like, there was too much of that. Like they needed to like hold back a little bit, because it's like, because it kind of takes away from Sylvanas as like, I don't want to say intimidating, but like as an antagonist, and even as like herself, like she's supposed to be this very wise, she has a lot of life experience. She's like very old. She's like a former Ranger general, so she has a lot of battle experience and she's been through a lot.
In this situation, she's supposed to have so much context as to like the fundamental workings of life and death itself. And she's talking with this guy on such a small, weird level. And like, that's why they have to justify it like that, because it's one of those things of like, why Anduin? And in game, they never explain why Anduin. We only get that in this book of Anduin is the focus of this just because of her own personal affiliations with his traits to her brother. And that's one of those things of like, okay, they explained the why Anduin and not anyone else, but again, if she's willing to apply those superficial traits there, why not to Delaran? Why not to anyone else on her path of carnage, making her even question for a moment if she's doing the right thing? The person she stops at is Anduin, not someone who reminds her of herself.
Right. The opposing leader of the faction who is like leading war against her people, which I guess she wanted him to do because she needed the death count.
That's one of those things I appreciate in the book of like, they at least go out of the way to go like, oh, Sylvanas is intentionally just doing a bunch of evil shit that she would oppose if she wasn't in this situation. Of like, she knows this is terrible. They basically have to justify justify all of the random nonsense that makes no sense in BFA as she's just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks.
It's all part of the plan. It's all working towards this end goal. This is kind of a tangent, but was it ever explained why they wanted Anduin in particular as a tool?
Yes, which that's kind of the part I was going to get to after we were done talking about the book, of like where they wanted someone who could basically just trick Carestia. Someone who could get into the most fortified part of the Shadowlands, get under her nose, and steal her sigil. The whole thing was just for the magic sigils, because Shadowlands just very suddenly shifted to the sigils midway through.
3 keys remain.
Okay, that's disappointing.
Hey all.
Hey, welcome back.
Still was just asking about why Anduin, and why is he the one that they're doing all this for? And the answer is, like I said, because they wanted him to be able to trick Carestia. They wanted him to be able to get under the Archon's nose, to get her sigil, and then get out. And the reason is really, really weird. Because the idea they say on the page is they're looking for a virtuous soul. They're looking for someone who embodies the ideals of Bastion, of their sacrifice. So Sylvanas goes and kidnaps people who she also has a bit of a grudge against. She kidnaps Anduin, Tyrande, Thrall, Bane, or tries to kidnap Tyrande, and then gets Jaina. And then, obviously, the one they single out because of his connection to the light is Anduin, which very convenient of Sylvanas. Very convenient for her. Imagine if he'd accidentally chose Jaina, and we could get sapphic romance connections instead. That would have been much more fun.
Fucking Toxic Yuri coming through this whole expansion. Now that would have been an expansion and a half, may I just say.
I would have loved that.
It's one of those things that becomes very confusing and makes it very apparent that they mostly chose Anduin for the connections to Sylvanas, and because he's so prominent, and because of his parallels to Arthas. Because in that 9.1 cinematic, it's not hyping up Anduin for the virtues of Bastion. It is hyping him up because he is a king.
My Archon, a living soul, seeks an audience.
A mortal?
A king. By all our measures, one who has spent his life striving for justice.
Is hyping him up because of his, like, very unsubtly paralleling Arthas as he walks by Uther. Uther clutches his Frostmourne scar as he reminisces about Arthas in this clear parallel.
One who would give anything to serve his people. One whose heart is true.
And the big definitive line that convinces Carestia is that this guy is worthy of your attention because he is a king.
A mortal?
A king.
Why?
The monarchist coming through at Blizzard again!
Not even just that. That's like, okay, that can just be character perspective if you want, but why does that convince Carestia, the person whose entire MO is washing away all of your pride, all of your connections to your life, and solely becoming devoted to the humility of Bastion? That's the opposite thing that would convince her, but they wanted the parallels to Arthas, so they wanted those moments, and they seemingly couldn't find the parallels to Arthas without that. And it's in that moment that he gets there. He's clearly just actually a mouthpiece for the jailer.
You have a key that I need.
He transforms into Dominated Boy with fuck-ass Bob, stabs her. And then we have the moment, which makes a lot of stuff very confusing, where while he's dominated, he is totally emotionless. Because obviously he's just kind of a body being used. But then for the briefest moment, the domination fades. And we get this moment where he basically almost like, it looks like he's waking up. Where he doesn't even know what he's doing. And then he looks down in horror at what his body is doing. Like, for the very first moment, he is realizing. And then after that, he gets dominated again. So in this moment, you get the implication of Anduin is not conscious while he is dominated. That is the implication in this moment, that he is not even aware of what his body is doing, which is not how it works in the later stuff, because as we see later, the big crux of a lot of his trauma going into the War Within is that he was conscious, and that he was so conscious that he didn't even know what emotions were his versus the jailer's.
How can I not when it all blurs together? It was so horrific and exhilarating. and it sickens me to think that satisfaction may have been mine.
I am not that person anymore! I have no light. Not after what I've seen. Not after what I've done.
Which I think is a more interesting round. I think that's a much more interesting way of framing domination, of it being so powerful, you don't even know that you're doing things against your will. Because that's, in a lot of ways, how it was with Sylvanas, too, where in the book, they describe it as Sylvanas, she's not unconscious. She is so conscious that she is despairing of what she is doing and blaming herself for what she is doing. And in that way, that makes for a very good foil, of a very good parallel of their very different reactions to their domination. And we get largely nothing else, really. We just get another moment of, the one moment we actually see him kill anything, which is 2 Vorkai in the middle of the heart of the forest. Those are the only confirmed kills that dominated Anduin has, is 2 Shadowlands natives who may or may not regenerate later.
He does nothing. He does no war crimes under his domination at all.
He stabs Carestia, who in the end is totally fine, and he briefly slashes a sword at the Primus, who is also totally fine.
It'd be very different if it showed you like a whole slaughter.
If I'm honest, he should have wounded Jaina. If you want this idea of he is so racked by the guilt of what he did, like this idea of, my friends trust me, but how can they trust me after what I did?
My friends. The ones I almost killed. They believe my hands are clean. But they don't feel clean. If I've no trust in myself, how can I expect my kingdom to trust me? To put their faith in me when mine has faltered.
Nothing he did is anything he really did to them. At most, he was squabbling with them during the Sylvanas fight. Because if you look at the Sylvanas fight, unfortunately, it's very poorly choreographed in that once you get to the final platform and you meet Anduin there, Thrall and Bolvar literally just stand there and do nothing, while Anduin is literally just wailing on Jaina, and Jaina is doing all the work.
So kind of like the Anduin fight later, where Thrall just stands at the bottom of the stairs like, go get him, guys.
Yes. Yeah, and then it's Jaina and Sylvanas doing all the work in the fight, yeah.
Uther just runs in and it's like, alright, go for it, Uther. Yeah, sure.
Those are his only real confirmed things when he is dominant. He kills 2 Vorkai. He has a battle that ultimately amounts to nothing because he doesn't wound anyone with Jaina, Thrall, and Bolvar. And then he has just enough to leave behind his locket. He departs for Zereth Mortis. He dominates a robot, and that's about it. He dominates the robot, and then the next thing is his fight, which the fight makes it very apparent. Again, this is not in any way Anduin. This is the jailer speaking through him, saying the worst things possible. He's spitting vitriol to Uther, to Sylvanas, about their weakness in dying to Arthas. These are very clearly things that do not come from Anduin whatsoever. They come from the jailer and his spite over these people defying him. And it's the same, like, we have that booming voice of, like, fulfill your final purpose, obliteration. And he's commanded to do that. And it's not until he gets magic ghost daddy intervention that he finds his will and splits the sword, which we still don't really know what that is, but that's a different point.
My son. This blade does not belong to darkness. It was forged by valor.
And also by honor.
Its legacy and ours are with you, even here.
Now, let it be finished.
And the only other real scene we have that kind of indicates, again, that there is a bit of a disconnect between the cinematic team and the gameplay team, in that the one at the end of 9.1, when he drops his locket, We see the memory in the locket. It's the scene between Anduin and Sylvanas, where she's basically very deep in her doubts, very deep in her regrets over dominating Anduin. And him basically going like, I feel myself slipping away every time he dominates me. I feel more and more of myself melding into what he's using me for, which is obviously set up for that 925 stuff.
Each time he dominates my will, I feel myself slipping further away. Is this what you felt when Arthas raised you, Sylvanas? Hollow, empty, everything you once were, consumed by darkness.
Yes, young lion. But in the end, the sacrifices we've made will have been worth it. Once the cycle of life and death has been broken and remade, we will...
By that time, I'll have been lost. And so will you. I only hope my friends will remember me as I was, not what you made me to be.
Of like, okay, they're very clearly setting up this idea in the cinematics that Anduin is losing himself. Anduin is melding more and more with the domination that the jailer is putting him under. Unfortunately, that's not very well telegraphed anywhere else, but that's the idea that it is telling us, that Anduin is slowly losing the ability to discern between what is the jailer and what is himself. And then once he's free, obviously we have the moment in Bastion where they're trying to reforge the Helm of Domination into something new. They have to purify the shards, and we get that very interesting moment of like talking about the concept of domination and how all of these different characters resisted it. And we get this very good moment, which is in a lot of contrast to the book, of Sylvanas basically talking about how she resisted domination, talking about how her anger was her strength. Her singular drive of purpose to fight Arthas was her strength. It was her passion to make things right after she was wrong that allowed her to resist domination and find herself again. And Anduin in turn takes those words to heart. He's able to expel some of the trauma of domination, but it's very clear that he's still affected. And then we get to the trial of Sylvanas. Sylvanas is banished to the Maw. We have that moment of like everyone there. Pelagos asked, does anyone oppose Sylvanas' judgment here? Does anyone oppose her being given to Rhonda, who is obviously going to do something terrible to her? Everyone else is angry, no one's refusing, and then we get this shot of Anduin, who is guilty and looking away as if he's about to speak up, and then he refrains, as if he wants to object.
Entrusting justice to your most fervent adversary. Are there any gathered here who object to this fate?
And that's when we get to the 925, the very last cinematic of Shadowlands, which is the epilogue of the Sylvanas book, where Sylvanas basically has this idea of, it's a very weird disconnect between the epilogue and what actually happens in the game, where Sylvanas basically is like, Anduin had seen it long before she had. The unacknowledged abyssal depth of her pain, the yearning for connection that had left her vulnerable. But it's very much clear it's supposed to be this idea of, okay, this is the end of Sylvanas' arc and the start of a new one for Anduin, because this is where we get to the 925 cinematic, and I want to hear your thoughts before I say mine.
The thing is, and I think Syl also agrees, I'm not particularly fond of it. It's fine, but I think, again, the Anduin parts let it down. It's like, okay, so what's a good punishment for Sylvanas if she's not dying this expansion? Well, you know, she stays in the Maw, tries to do what she needs to do, which is bizarre at the get-go, I think, because, okay, they already have, like, Pelagos, who is now the new Arbiter, you know.
It's one of those things where who is going to actually do the job for the people already there? Someone has to. Who wants to do that job? Nobody. It's better that Sylvanas enact restorative justice than just get senselessly punished. That ultimately is one of the moments of, one of the themes in Shadowlands is this idea of justice versus vengeance, and I think it's very wishy-washy at times, but I think that's one of the few moments where it lands properly, because ultimately the idea there is vengeance is just killing Sylvanas there and then. It gets you a moment of catharsis, it gets you a moment of, she's dead, the person who did this is punished. That is vengeance. Justice in this situation is fixing her mistakes. And justice in this situation is not giving Sylvanas the death she'd been yearning for the whole time. Justice is making her live with these choices and living with them enough to fix them. So having her do that is a little bit inefficient, but it's thematically it fits as Sylvanas' temporary end of she is enacting restorative justice for the crimes she committed.
Now, when does Anduin get to punch her in the face for a crime? Ha 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 ha. Okay, then it gets to the Anduin bit. So fucking wishy-washy again. I don't know what's going on with Anduin at this end part. Oh, I kind of liked it. When was that in Shadowlands? Again, it's the writing team going, no bro, just trust us on this. This is totally how he felt. It wasn't even in the Sylvanas book. Yes, we didn't have any insights into Anduin's train of thought, but you would think with all the resources that you had for that entire expansion, and then you also get a novel too. There'd be one moment where, I don't know, Anduin's striking down, like you said, a Vorquin or something, or some guy who gets in his way and does like a little evil sort of smirk.
I almost wonder if we might get flashbacks to that in his short story. If that might be one of the things of like explaining to people his trauma of what his mindset was in those moments of why he currently hates himself so much.
Hear me out. But again, I feel like my running theme during all these videos is the idea behind that isn't a bad writing idea. Okay, so a guy gets mind control, but it was in control enough to kind of take some enjoyment of just like lashing out and just being powerful and pushing people out of the way and having no fear of the consequences of his actions. Okay, sure. But again, and I feel like certain content creators too all go, well, yeah, that was already in the story. Like,
it is one of those things of if they wanted that, they needed him to not be dead in the face when he's done with it. They needed it to be like, this is the jailer wholly controlling his body. If they want to do the Arthas parallel, pull up the classic evil grin DK Arthas face. Have him look menacing and terrible and clearly enjoying this.
I don't think that is ridiculous for us to ask for that, because you can extrapolate so much from a story, sure, but we're extrapolating the whole story in our head. That's why I actually would put down my foot is, that's why so many people get into arguments about WoW lore and WoW stories, and not for the better. It's because it's so fucking vague.
That's one of the things that I have been frustrated with for about 14 years now is one of the core issues with WoW arguments is about 90% of the time, both people are right. They just have different interpretations that aren't debunked by the narrative. Like, when you look at Sylvanas in Cataclysm, I don't see Sylvanas as an evil person in Cataclysm. I see Sylvanas as someone who is pushed to the brink by a very racist war chief, forcing her to assault Gilneas, claim this port for him, and in her efforts to preserve her people, preserve the people she cares about, the people who will protect her, she is willing to enact these horrible actions like utilizing the Blight, like raising more people from the dead, because if she doesn't do that, her people will die out. She has been forced into this offensive by Garrosh. She has no other choice but to do that, and she's not the kind of person who's going to wax poetic about how sad it makes her. She's willing to just get shit done. So of course we don't see her waxing poetic about it in game. But for another person, Sylvanas is the devil incarnate in Cataclysm, because to them, they only see the in-game perspective. They only see Garrosh opposing her use of the Blight. They only see Garrosh opposing her use of the Valkyr. They don't see the context of Gilneas, because the game never once tells you why Sylvanas is in Gilneas. So to them, they think Sylvanas is the evil person in this situation. Sylvanas is the biggest bad. Garrosh is this signifier of, oh, he's a bad war chief, and even he's opposing this. That must make her really bad. And that perspective is not invalid, because the game does not invalidate it. The game, through its omission of the rest of the story, actively validates it.
That is always what pisses me off about WoW's writing. Like, in so many things, like you said, it's because there isn't a outward denial of these things, or at least a clarification within the story that isn't just, oh, use your imaginations, guys, or can't you use your critical thinking skills to get through this? And I want to be like, yes, I had plenty of those. However, your story isn't conducive with telling this correctly, because it opens up such a wide interpretation when it's clear you only had one interpretation, the writers. You wanted to interpret it as this, because like you said, Gilneas is there. You can go to Gilneas, but there's no interlinking parts. And again, the coherency and the flow of said stories. And we know because like things are removed from this game all the time. Actual literal quests are removed from this game that make more sense. Rathian's quest that create like I said, a discombobulation in your player base interpreting these things. And this is what irritates me about like Shadowlands. You've come all these years and you've seen that this is an issue of people constantly fighting about lore and, you know, things that it's like, well, if you do this part, this part, this part, this part, this makes sense, okay? And then you get to Shadowlands. So you feel like for a moment you're like, okay, that makes sense because it's back in Cataclysm and they kind of knew how to story write, right? And they did do a lot of good like self-contained story quest again, yes, but they were still kind of working out the idea of like a major narrative that didn't fall directly into the storytelling of the RTS Warcraft games. So they're still sort of working that out for themselves. So this many years later, almost 18 years later, and they're still having that issue of being able to create a narrative. And yeah, of course, there's always going to be room for nuance within that, of course. But like that, where does that come from? Where? It's like the whole bloody Rathian and the Whispers things again, too. Like, you're showing these characters acting immature and fighting above ground. Okay, sure, cool. Okay, this is the worst we're going to get. Okay, go underground. They're doing the exact same thing.
It's one of those unfortunate things where, like I said, in that situation, if you have the context of the short story, you understand, okay, this is emphasizing the facade he's putting up. He has these insecurities underneath it, but it's emphasizing that. But the game does not tell you that. So to the average player, they just think the Whispers are exaggerating his arrogance. They're exaggerating his standoffishness.
And then the Whispers aren't even working consistently either.
Turns out they aren't working on Abyssian, the guy who's most vulnerable to them.
And this is the thing. Then we start extrapolating and people start arguing, well, that's because they wanted something and it's a cause of their, you know, or own issues, their own weaknesses. Okay, but like, is Abyssian being judgmental not a weakness or an issue, being judgmental of the people around him? Like, the inconsistency. And like I said, this directly flows on to storytelling and the delivery of story. And yes, it is difficult to deliver a story in a game like WoW with that sort of like consistency. It hasn't had a very strong start in sort of like base like Final Fantasy 14. However, we've seen this work, and saying that, well, they don't have time to make a quest to follow up on this. Hey, but they certainly did like a whole big quest line about the blue Dragonflight all holding hands and like kissing and making up, you know. And then it falls to this bit with Anduin in Shadowlands. You expect me to believe, you, the game, are expecting me to believe that Anduin enjoyed these things that he was doing while dominated. Okay, where? And I would really love for someone to be like, see, it was this part in the story where it isn't there.
It would feel better, I think, if this was treated as a reveal. It might make more sense, but it's not really. It's just treated like Anduin outpouring his emotions because we've seen him be guilty over this during the quests prior to this. So it's not treated as like this, oh, sudden revelation.
Exactly. And then that also follows into the idea of like, where has Anduin ever shown sadism though? I think it's a poor, we could argue that his need for vengeance and his need for justice.
It's one of those things where I think you can extrapolate the idea of he's never had the opportunity to do that before. He has never had the place where it would present that opportunity. And in this point he did, and it was under someone else doing it for him. And so to explore the idea of, oh, he actually did feel that in those moments is something that's very plausible if we had seen him as anything other than an emotionless automaton.
Exactly. And then that plays into, what, did he enjoy punching Rathian? We never know about that. His area is physically hurting someone else. Did he enjoy mind controlling the SI7 agents in Pandaria?
I want to say, beyond that detail, what are your thoughts about the rest of this cinematic?
I don't know. I think it's, like I said, I think the Sylvanas bit is okay. I do actually think I like that sort of conclusion for Sylvanas.
I have faced who I was and accepted what I've done. Now, the work begins.
Also, it allows, you know, it does allow her to come back into the story as need be. For Anduin's like, I don't think it's a satisfying resolution to his story. It's very odd, like how Sylvanas is like, you'll find, what is the line that she uses about like learning to accept responsibility or something along those lines, Port? I forget.
She said the idea of like, I faced who I was, I've accepted what I've done, now the work begins. The idea that Anduin in the future needs to face who he is, figure out who he is, accept what is him versus what he was made to be. That's part of what I do like about it. Before I go on my mostly praise of it, what do you think of it, Syl? What are your thoughts on this final cinematic as the last real plot point of Anduin that we're discussing before we move on to the future stuff?
Okay, so this basically gives me more of what I don't like about the Anduin Sylvanas dynamic, which is them becoming progressively more amicable towards each other. Like Sylvanas being a sounding board or a sympathetic shoulder for Anduin to lean on, you know, in this moment as we're starting to see like the first signs of his PTSD or him talking about it at least. So I don't really like that about it. That continues to grate me the wrong way, especially when there's such resistance to him changing his mind and becoming sympathetic to other characters that I like. That's just the one thing. It's just like a petty personal thing. I just don't really like their dynamic, and I don't really like that this is the direction they chose to take.
I think that's what pisses me off too. Just you saying that. I don't like Sylvanas's and Anduin's dynamic, and I think that is a major overarching issue. And all of this, I don't care. I don't like the two characters interact. And I know that's what they've been trying to push. And there's been possible chances for them to be good foils. I just still don't like it. I think it was one of the weakest choices ever made in game. They have no chemistry, and it kind of sucks ass.
I really don't like the line, must you bear that weight? Like,
if I've no trust in myself, how can I expect my kingdom to trust me? To put their faith in me when mine has faltered.
Must you bear that weight?
It's a beautiful line. Love it in isolation.
We have very different thoughts. I'm going to go into that a lot in depth.
Okay. I think in isolation, extreme isolation, if I can just forget everything about these two characters and the game I've just played and just kind of focus on like the voice actresses, line delivery, you know, I like it. That's just like one part of it. And then the second part of it is I think that Warcraft is trying to do two different things at once with Anduin's trauma. They're trying to give him the trauma of being mind controlled and forced to do the jailer's bidding. So him being like a passive receiver of torment. And then they're trying to handle this other trauma, which you guys sort of talked about, which is like the trauma where this extreme situation either reveals this hidden part of him that actually enjoyed causing the carnage, or him being so disoriented from the mind control that he has totally lost track of like where he himself ended and where the jailer begins. And so I kind of don't like this because I think instead of doing that, instead of kind of trying to shoehorn this, oh, Anduin can't tell if he's evil now or not, if he is like Zoval, if there is this bad part of him, which I feel like is kind of weak because it kind of also takes the responsibility of actually doing bad things from him. I think it would be like more interesting to explore a kind of trauma based on the actions he took as king during the Fourth War. So like kind of playing off that moment in Shadows Rising in the tavern where he's tormented about sending farmers off to war or having soldiers die for him, letting the torture happen because he wanted to pursue Sylvanas so much.
It was already there for him, but you think that Shadowlands has mitigated that into a sort of a non-responsibility again, an easier out for the writers later for saying.
And part of it is also the fact that they needed to do a hard turn into Sylvanas not being the biggest villain in the entire Warcraft franchise. And a lot of the trauma he had and a lot of the burdens he had in that book was related to the stress of finding Sylvanas. And it's very hard to keep up that idea of literally everyone hates her and she can never have any interactions with anyone ever again because everyone hates her. She needed someone in her corner, and I think Anduin just drew the short stick there.
Yeah, he really did. Just one last thing. This is like barely related to the cutscene, but I personally feel like the story would have been way more interesting if Anduin had chosen of his own free will to join Sylvanas and the jailer, no matter how antagonistic that alliance would have have been like if he had made the choice. I don't really like that Sylvanas took that choice from him. I think that his PTSD and the trauma that we're seeing now would be much more impactful and have more meaning if he actually did do something quote unquote bad, meaning he compromised his morals, kind of chose to align himself with these evil forces because he was persuaded to Sylvanas' vision in some way. He could see that she had a point.
If you want to make it interesting, you could have her not do it, have her at that precipice at the end of the second Torghast cinematic, and have her go, no, I won't, but I can't abandon this either. And then maybe have Anduin see a bit of merit in it of, clearly this is not someone just willing to do evil for evil's sake. This is someone doing these things for a purpose, something connected to her own personal desires, and maybe that appeals to him a little bit in some way. Even just a little bit. It's hard to do when Anduin has been built up so much as the moral arbiter in these cinematics up until that point. There's really no way out of him refusing because they've been so adamant through BFA and Shadowlands that Anduin is the pinnacle of everything good. Anduin would never do this.
That would create a very interesting sort of take on it there too. And then the other bit about is like find out who you want to be and find out more about yourself. That those sort of lingering words to Anduin in that cutscene. I will say this. By themselves, it sounds pretty good. It's like, well, you know, maybe you got to reflect on being the king and stuff like that. But this is the weirdest thing to undermine it. How immediately in Dragonflight, it's like all the people are storming, missing Anduin, wish he comes back. I think that undermines that line because everything is leading up to Anduin returning to these people unironically.
Let me explain, and that's a good segue into me explaining why I like this cinematic. Despite some of the stuff in Dragonflight, despite the stuff that came before, I think first, I think this is almost an attempt to give Anduin some of his agency back because up until this point, and even during his domination, it's very clear he did not have agency. He had things happen to him. And I think this addition of the idea that he might have enjoyed it is a way of going, here is something within Anduin that he didn't expect, something that is his. It is not someone doing something to him. It is something that he, amidst something happening to him, realized is his and not someone else's. He might be wrong in that. He might be blurring it together, but the thing in this cinematic is basically him going like, oh, my hands don't feel clean after what I did. And then Sylvanas goes, you need to make sure you know what you're made to do with what you choose to do.
They believe my hands are clean, but they don't feel clean.
It is perilous to confuse what you are made to do with what you choose to do.
And then after that, he reveals, no, but this felt exhilarating. This felt good. And it might have been mine. It might have deep down been something buried within me.
It was so horrific and exhilarating. And it sickens me to think that satisfaction may have been mine.
And that's when she goes to the idea of, oh, this isn't the jailer's, this might be yours. This might be something you are grappling with in the same way I have in the past.
Ah, so that's why you've come. You fear you might not be who you thought you were.
And I think, in one way, that's their way of just trying to give him something to explore outside of being so good that doing such bad makes him feel bad and being really sad about being bad when he can't be good, and now he's being sad about being good again. Which is pretty much what Anduin has been up until this point, whereas this offers something of, okay, here's a little bit of flavor to Anduin. Here's a little bit of, oh, he's got a bit of a sadistic streak. He's got a bit of a mean streak. Let's explore that. Let's explore the idea that Anduin has some humanity in him. Anduin has some imperfection in him, and not just pure goodness.
And you know what? I'm going to say this. That is all really good points. And God, I wish. I think this is the thing, again, that we're saying. These points aren't bad ideas to explore within this story at all, if they're explored.
Yeah, that's the thing is, like, I don't trust that they're going to follow up on that.
Despite all Sylvanas has said, I can't help but have hope for things. Despite all my cynicism, all my criticism, I can't help but have hope for the future.
Well, that's why we're all still here.
Ultimately, like what you said, I think the critiques of the Sylvanas-Anduin relationship is valid, and I also think this is intended to be the end of that. I think this is very much intended to be the very literal final line is, farewell, little lion.
Farewell, little lion.
I do think that is very intentionally putting that version of their relationship to a permanent end. That if they interact going forward, it is going to be something different, something that is not defined by Sylvanas relating him to her brother and the perfect pedestal of her brother.
I'm going to give you cursed takes on that, Port. Next time that should be, oh, no longer you're a little lion. You are a true lion. You know that's Blizzard writing, though. You know it is.
I hope not. I really hope it's supposed to be this is an end for that.
I can only hope and pray. I'm literally down on my knees. I'm like, and this is the thing. Both characters, again, Sylvanas, ignoring all fucking Sylvanas' haters. I'm not a Sylvanas hater. She's a good character. She's an interesting character. Shadowlands didn't treat her right, and BFA didn't treat her right, but that was all there. Anduin is the same. He's a good character with a lot of potential. Yes, these things aren't treating him correctly, and it's weird how it isn't treating him correctly because it's textually there. You could, with a small shove with writing, you can change the course of this writing so easily. So easily. Like, much like this line about Anduin being like, it was exhilarating, it's mine.
It was so horrific and exhilarating. And it sickens me to think that satisfaction may have been mine.
That can be worked with so much. So much.
Which I think progressing through the cinematic, I think the cause and effect of the cinematic, and I think for the first time in Shadowlands, this feeling like two people just having a casual conversation and not just monologuing at each other. Because so much of Shadowlands really felt like that. Whereas this felt like two people just having a conversation about things that happened. In part because they let the voice actors just speak like normal people and not talk like this all the time. With pauses for dramatic effects.
Or sighing like Abyssian.
Like, anyways, what happens from there is this idea that Anduin, when Sylvanas goes, they're like, oh, you might think you're not who you thought you are. You might think this new side reveals that you're someone different. And it's at that point that Anduin reveals that he's afraid to call on the light because he doesn't know if he ever knew. But
You fear you might not be who you thought you were.
I'm starting to wonder if I ever knew. For the first time in my life, I'm afraid that if I call on the light, it won't answer.
I think in this moment, it's Anduin going, if this is part of me, am I worthy of it? Because even when he was suffering as king, even when he was miserable under all of these burdens, it was still in his head this idea that he is this fundamentally good, noble person, and that he needs to suffer under this stuff because he is good, and this is his duty. It is his duty to others. And this, for the first time, is a selfish thing. This is something that brings him pleasure, potentially at the cost of others. And that is so fundamentally against everything he thought he was, that who he was that priest. What is he now if he is not that? He might be afraid. Will he not be able to call him that anymore if he is no longer that person? If he is no longer that good person defined by his very binary view of good and evil, will he be able to? And then it's from there, it's, if I can't be that person, how can my kingdom trust me?
If I've no trust in myself, how can I expect my kingdom to trust me? To put their faith in me when mine has faltered.
Must you bear that weight?
And it's where I actually do very much love that line from Sylvanas of must you bear that weight, because this is the first person in 12 years of Anduin's story that has finally asked him, do you need to be king? It is the very first person that has asked him that. And in this moment, Anduin basically goes that he doesn't have a choice. He has to be king. Being a king is who he is. And
a king does not have a choice.
It is from there that Sylvanas brings up her very good, sly remark of, I thought you believed in free will, Anduin.
No choice. I thought you believed in free will.
And that's a very good moment, not only because it very much brings all of her nonsense about free will to a close, but it brings it to a close not only in a way that for the first time actually fits Sylvanas being narky, and it also fits her in a way of actually using free will and the idea of choice logically, after 4 years of using it nonsensically. And it ties really well to Anduin of, do you have to be king? You do have a choice. You do have free will. You are not bound to the obligation and the responsibility of being king. And I think that's a really good moment of Sylvanas, of all people, the person most people consider the worst person in the franchise, is the one person that actually has Anduin's back. That is actually giving him this moment of, after everything, why do you still think you have to do this? After all of this convincing you gave me of having free will, of always having a choice, and me not listening until the very end, why do you suddenly think that doesn't apply to you, Anduin? And that's a good character moment of Anduin has always very much had this idea of wanting to alleviate others' suffering, wanting to alleviate others' pain, but never applying that to himself, of always shouldering these burdens on himself. And it's the same with his idea of free will, of he's always believed in the free will of others, believed in the choices of others, even the worst people in the universe like Garrosh and Sylvanas, but he's never applied that to himself. And now Sylvanas is turning that back around on him of, no, it does apply to you. And that's where he gets a little moment of humorous realization and then kind of gets the moment of needing to think about it, of needing to process all of that.
I need time to think about many things.
And that's when Sylvanas goes, I've done all the work there. I have realized who I am, good and bad. I've realized my flaws, realized my virtues. I know what I've done, the good, the bad. And now she has to deal with that. Now she has to deal with the consequences of who she is and what she's done.
Anduin, I have faced who I was and accepted what I've done. Now, the work begins.
Yes, it does.
And now Anduin needs to do that. That is the end of Sylvanas' arc, complicated and messy and destructive as it was. And now it is the start of Anduin, for the first time since Legion, having agency, having choices to make again. This is Anduin actually having an arc again. This is not Anduin being passive. This is not Anduin just reacting to things. Anduin is actively going to the sword. He is actively choosing to help Thrall with this situation. And hopefully, going into the War Within, he will actively choose to address these issues. And beyond that, actively choose to not be king. Actively choose to make the best choice for himself, to not bear these responsibilities that he is clearly not made for.
Dear God, I hope it is that. Paul, I'm literally on my knees here, hands clasped, begging for that. Honestly, because that's the best result that we can get from this here. 100%. Like 100%.
I think it's nice seeing your guys' very pessimistic view of the cinematic contest and my very optimistic one, because in this, I've been a very, this could work, but, and right now we are at the point that I've been in all of those moments before they came out, I had those opinions of this moment right here has so much potential with whatever they followed up with. There is so much potential to do things with these characters. And in a lot of those moments, they have unfortunately let me down pretty severely. And right now we are in that moment before the follow-up of this moment right here, as this last moment is the perfect way to end the Sylvanas-Anduin relationship, to end Sylvanas' arc, while finally giving Anduin one again that gives his character agency. It's just a matter of if they follow that up. If they follow up the flaws of Shadows Rising. If they follow up this idea that Anduin, deep down, does not want to be king. Anduin is not built to be king. He is not built for this burden thrust upon him by his hereditary inheritance. That someone who does want that needs to take that role, and he needs to take a role that lets him be Anduin, flaws and all. That should be the arc that Anduin starts with this cinematic.
Thank you. It should be. It should be. I just still have my fears, and I feel that it's going to be a reverse on that. Like, everything that you've said there, it's going to be instead Thrall teaches him how to be a good leader. I realise I don't need to be king. I need to be a good king. You know, it'll be something BS like that. We're not so much pessimistic, I feel, is we want what you've just said to happen. And we can see the tools there laid bare before the writers. I just hope that the writers' biases don't get in the way of that. And I think that is their greatest hurdle, their own biases when it comes to writing this. Because I actually will firmly say I do think a lot of the writers are monarchists, right? They do like the idea of having the fantasy king, right? And I think they might be scared of an idea of like exploring that, someone finding out who they truly are that doesn't restore the status quo.
Which I guess is a good way to kind of transition into talking about his brief mentions in Dragonflight, which the first one is from Rathian, through implication.
Behold, Stormwind, capital of the human kingdom and crown jewel of the Alliance. Ruled by a dear, dear friend who is sadly absent.
which is a very good kind of moment of showing his feelings are still there towards Anduin, showing that he desperately wishes Anduin were here. And then the moments, likewise, of Rathian mentioning it to Shaw, and then Shaw mentioning it again, of Rathian is clearly actively looking for Anduin.
King Greymane, I thought you should know. Rathian asked if there's been any word from...
Anduin? He asked me the same question. Though their friendship has been strained, I know the king considers Rathian an ally.
And they go through the whole thing of like, oh, the House of Nobles, air quotes, the evil people, love Turallion, but the people of Stormwind miss their king.
Turallion is popular with the nobles, and he's a natural leader to our soldiers. But the people of Stormwind miss their king.
And it's this very big moment of like, very charitably, I can put this to perspective of Shaw is a very staunch royalist. He is probably not consciously going to favor opinions that like Anduin because he is a very pro-Anduin person. Even though in an ideal world, we could very much tell a story about how both Shaw and Anduin are bound by their obligations. How one of the fun points in the Visions of N'Zoth was the Old Town district, which had Shaw as the end boss. And one of the challenge masks there kind of reveals what his story is, about how he lost loves, he lost friends, he lost everything in the name of his duty to the crown. And now he's left with nothing but his regrets and his guilt. And that is what's feeding his devotion to N'Zoth. Because ultimately, Shaw is a very similar character to Anduin. He just is in the subservient position rather than the dominant one. Where it's one of those very interesting implications that they did continue in the human heritage of his relationship to Edwin Van Cleef and their implied young romance.
The actual OG, the GOAT, Mr. Van Cleef.
Yeah, and how ultimately Shaw sacrificed him for the sake of everything, and how in this theoretical vision of the Zoth, he probably sacrificed Flynn too. He's probably sacrificed everything for the name of his devotion to what is a corrupted Anduin in this universe. And so I think in an ideal world, Shaw himself could also get an arc of realizing that in the same way his devotion to Anduin is not very healthy, Anduin's devotion to his duty is not healthy, and that Anduin deserves something better for himself, that he doesn't have to sacrifice himself at the altar of duty. But at this point, the thing we only really have is this idea of Shaw being very pro-royalist, pro-King Rin, and touting the idea of the people missing him. But the next thing is the one we got in 1025 with Shaw and Gand, which is, despite what he said there, when he found Anduin, he's not turning him over to the Alliance. He is not going to Turallion, going to the nobles, and reporting where their lost king is. He is going to someone he trusts to keep secrecy in Gen, and they ultimately choose to let Anduin keep his anonymity, to let him keep on whatever path he is going now, whether consciously or subconsciously, letting him explore himself outside of the burdens of King.
I'm going to take a different interpretation of that. It's almost a let Anduin keep on going with what he's doing because he will come back in the end.
Which, yes, that is one of those things that there are two very big interpretations for this, because going into the War Within, we have these very two paths we've laid out of, I think now we have officially stopped the recap. After 12 or so hours, however long it is, we have finally finished talking about Anduin's story. Now we are caught up to the present, and this is now our section of looking to the future. So what is Anduin's potential future? What do we hope for his future? What do we think is going to happen in his future? Because those are two very different things. I think we have two very specific paths that we've kind of already talked about a lot. One is that Anduin, over the course of everything, realizes that he does not have to shoulder the burden of King. He does not have to shoulder this burden that makes him miserable. He can be just Anduin. He doesn't need to be King Rin. He doesn't need to be the son of Varian Rin. He doesn't need to be everything people are expecting of him in order to fulfill a duty, because that is one of those important things to note, is that fulfilling a duty is not the issue with Anduin. It is fulfilling this specific duty that causes him so much guilt. It is shouldering these burdens that he is not the kind of person to shoulder. He is not the kind of person to carry those guilts.
Yeah. And it's also the idea, I think, in Anduin's mind, not to let these people down, right?
Yes. And the idea that he thinks at this point, the only way he can serve the people of Stormwind, serve the people of Azeroth, is by shouldering those burdens of King.
And that he is the only person who can do that, I think, as well.
In part because he's been built that all through his life and built this idea that even though he is this naive 17-year-old boy, recently lost his father, congrats, boy, you are now king of an entire kingdom and an entire multiracial faction.
And no one else can do it but you.
There is very much this idea of he realizes someone else can do that. Someone who wants to do that can do it. Someone who is good at it can do it. And Anduin can still serve the people of Stormwind and the people of Azeroth without being that. He can be just Anduin, the priest. Anduin, the person who goes out in the world and helps people. He can help people by just doing things like defending the Veil, or defending the Temple of the Red Crane, or beseeching Zuen to let people into the Veil. Doing things as a person through his own virtues to actively do good, not things that weigh him down with guilt and suffering. That is one very big potential path, is Anduin gains positive development towards realizing he is a person outside of his obligations as king, and that he does not have to bear that, which in turn promises a lot of development for Stormwind, for the House of Nobles, for Turalyon, of what does this mean for Stormwind? What does this mean for what some people might view as a selfish act of Anduin prioritizing himself over these thousands of people that should rely on him? But then you can bring up that, hey, they went through 5 years of peace without him. They've been through a pretty good time without Anduin. Some of them probably might not like him and might favor Turalyon a lot more. You could bring up those things and bring up the fact that maybe other people can do it better than him.
Exactly. And we're also missing another point that, and actually looking far into the future with Midnight, what about a reunion of human nations, or an allegiance between human nations again? Because that sure hasn't existed in a very long time. And Vanessa brings up the good point of course, it's the young nobles who are the forward-thinking ones here, the ones who are going to change everything. However, that idea isn't a bad idea at all. The idea of people who are setting out to reunify people, and through that Westfall, Arathi, Alterac, Lordran.
The Seven Kingdoms, basically.
The idea of them unifying but not under a king is interesting because it changes, and then it would actually create a good story of maybe that you could create within the Horde and the Alliance.
Because also the idea that even just within Stormwind, not all the people in Stormwind are humans who serve their Stormwindian king anymore. There are Lordoranians there are Alteraci there are... How do the people of Stromgarde feel basically being a vassal state under Anduin? How do all the dwarves that live there? They have a whole district there.
And the thing is that is there, and of course there can be no one king to rule over the 7 nations of human states, because again it's just falling into that same trap again.
I mean, not if they love Game of Thrones, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm.
All right, we're gonna start some fights here, boys.
Obviously, I think I could speak for all three of us in saying that is our ideal interpretation of Anduin. That is the thing that we would prefer Anduin's arc to go down from War Within onward. Whereas option number 2 is, like we've talked about throughout this talk, the Return of the King.
Play ominous music now. Return of the King.
Dun, 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 dun. You need to actually play that over that clip and have our terrible voices.
An hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men comes crashing down. But it is not this day. This day we fight. I bid you stand.
But yes, it's playing into the traditional Arthurian tale, but without the awareness of it. As in, it's okay. Anduin was being a king, but he wasn't being the king. He wasn't being a good king. And he learns how to be and grow into that role to become the ultimate king.
Even then, there are points where it is, Anduin isn't being the king, but he's still a good king, because one thing I actually neglected to mention from Dragonflight is the Defias heritage, in which Anduin, off-screen, and having never revealed this prior, solved the Defias issue, essentially. He pardoned the Defias. They no longer have a valid grievance. Anyone still fighting for the Defias is just a petty bandit.
Is a hater, actually, Port. They're just nasty haters, actually.
Even someone as anti-monarchist, as so fundamentally for the people as Vanessa, can't help but go, well, Anduin actually did do these really great things. Anduin did a lot for us, and he has a lot of valid points. Even amidst fighting a literal world war against the Legion, back-to-back with a world war against the Horde, back-to-back with chasing Sylvanas down, back-to-back with being kidnapped, somehow he found time to pardon all the Defias and solve the political issues of Westfall.
God knows that all you need to do against people that you've subjugated and, displaced from their homes and treated like, a petty criminals. It's just give him some money, guys. It's okay. That's all you need to do.
This money that he has lying around after all the resource.
After the multiple world wars, and they're literally sacrificing the farmers of Westfall for this war. Nobody brings that up in the Heritage Trust.
How much is your dad worth? What, 1 million gold? Is that how much you're worth? 1 million. There you go.
It's just one banana, Vanessa.
My God.
Which, in turn, despite that good king stuff, Human Heritage does still give me some hope with the little epilogue introducing us to not just the main character of Lady Clessington, but that new other lord from Eastvale. There are very clearly young blood nobles in this system, and they're trying to make what is essentially a House of Commons in Stormwind, and they are seeding the roots of political reform within Stormwind, and it is up to future writers to take the route of doing that or not, and how they will address the matter of king under that, because despite having one, the House of Lords and Commons are the ruling power of England for all intents and purposes. They have a monarch. The monarch does legally sign off on things, but it is essentially just a decorative thing. And Stormwind, I don't think they're going to go the route in WoW of having a decorative king and the politics that come with it. I do think if they are to do the idea of a House of Lords and Commons as the ruling power, that the monarchy would be abolished. But it's just the route of will they do that? Because the other route, as we mentioned, is the return of the king. Of the idea that Anduin's arc going forward is not realizing that he is not someone built for these burdens, he is not someone that has to shoulder these burdens, but instead that he is someone that just needs to figure out how to shoulder these burdens, that he is someone who needs to find out how to be a good king rather than suffer through it. He needs to figure out how to make himself not suffer while being king, and then he can return to the throne. And that's largely my fear over his trauma, is that his trauma will be essentially the Anduin arc. It will be the arc of Anduin learning how to not let his emotions get in the way, how to not let his guilt, how to not let his unwillingness to compromise his peaceful ideals, his desire to not see people suffer with the realities of being king. Because those ultimately are the only two routes you really can take that moral quandary for him, is either he stands firm to those ideas and refuses to be a part of the system, or he abandons those ideas and hardens himself to become a part of the system. And I think the idea of him hardening himself, even amidst BFA's Anduin, even amidst all of his moral arbiter stuff in BFA and Shadowlands, Anduin was never someone who was intentionally written as hardened and cruel. He was never written as someone who that was an ideal for him. The points in which he was written as being callous, as being uncaring about people suffering, were intentionally moments in Shadows Rising where he was in a bad state for that. He was cracking under the pressure. And in a book like the Sylvanas novel, those moments don't really have much to do with him being king. Those are just unintentional moments of him being a jackass.
Unfortunately, that's death of the author that we just need to take with that.
So those don't really have much to do with it. Shadows Rising is very much the focus on him being a jackass in relationship to being king, in which those moments are very clearly framed as this is not good for him. This is not him in his best state. So how will they do that going forward is that really that question of will they harden him to do it? Because depending on your interpretation of the current marketing, you could either see the war within Anduin as Anduin of he is slowly shedding off the priestly look, he's shedding off the tassels, he's shedding off the blue. He is becoming more and more of a warrior, of a paladin. He is becoming the gruff guy as he ages.
He's becoming Uther on the cover of the fairy tale cover.
Yeah, pretty much. Or you can interpret this as Anduin at his lowest. You can interpret this as Anduin is not taking care of himself. Anduin is letting himself go. Anduin has the just fuck me up haircut. He has a messy beard. He has horribly taken care of skin. He has battered armor. He has shed off the things that make him who he is. He is just taking on essentially the role of Varian in his self-doubt. And it remains to be seen which is correct until we actually see him in game, because you can very much, it's even despite what I think is more obvious, the idea that he is fucked up and not in a good headspace, it is still up for interpretation, especially when it comes to in-game people who have a very different view of his character.
Exactly. And that fucked up being at the lowest point of the low could still be interpreted as this is because he isn't king at the moment.
Yeah, because the most notable thing in his outfit is while he has the armor, he is missing the Stormwind blue.
Stormwind blue, and when he regains the Stormwind blue, he will be whole again.
I'm a little pessimistic about this because I feel like a theme that they've been kind of pushing with Anduin is that he needs to fight. He needs to be a warrior. He can't just be a priest. He can't just be a diplomat. In order to do good in the world, he needs to pick up a sword, become a man, and fight.
Well, at the same time, the BFA cinematic is so different from that, and that was the last moment of Metzin's Anduin. That was the last moment of what he saw as Anduin's arc, of the thing that fulfilled Anduin most in the BFA cinematic was not using the sword to fight the Horde. It was not battering down a troll in front of him. It was very literally dropping the sword, having a lightning bolt come into the sky, and calling down the light to fulfill his actual calling, which is to be a healer, which is to help people. And that was ultimately the last real moment of Metzin in the story. And so now, all these years later, obviously, a lot of the War Within will be informed by stuff post-Metzin, more specifically the Shadowlands and Dragonflight stuff, because BFA was a very different story. And in those, I do think Anduin is still very much shown to be what is supposed to be kind, what is supposed to be someone who so fundamentally sees good and peace that the idea that he could be unvirtuous has caused him to not use the light anymore. And so I think if we're gonna get that idea of him becoming Manduin, of him becoming more gruff, I do think it's going to be more along the lines of him accepting some of his flaws, him accepting some of his insecurities as him, like that potential for a bit of enjoyment in combat, that potential for a bit of sadism, wherever that might come from, of these things are flaws, these things are bad parts of him, that selfish enjoyment is a part of him, and that makes him him, not his burdens. So I do think you could still take that as a positive route of he doesn't need to be king, rather than those gruff things are things he needs to lean into in order to be king. Because I do think that that stuff with Varian was the Legion angle, and I think the angle in the BFA cinematic is very different. And I think Anduin has, for all intents and purposes, paused as a character since that moment. He has basically been on pause. He gets a brief moment of characterization in Shadows Rising, but largely in-game, he has been on pause until 925. That is where the arc really picks up again.
Yeah, I do agree with that, by the way. It feels like Anduin has been very static. He's just been, like I said, given that mantle of the moral center point of the story, but his actual growth has been incredibly, incredibly static. Like you said, other than Shadows Rising. I'm going to give my interpretation, by the way, of this, just in regards to that, both positive and the negative. And positive is very much following on with the idea that we've just been discussing, but also a positive of Anduin being, I mean, we're laughing about Manduin, but the idea of finally recognizing one's agency as an adult. And the thing is that it's okay if they interlink. I'm going to say this, it's okay that Manduin, dear God, someone shoot me now saying those words.
Friendship over.
Friendship, oh God, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. Manduin, okay if it's actually framed as the idea of finally finding oneself as like I said, the agency of adulthood. The idea that he's finally shedding the naive ideas of being a boy, but it doesn't lose his kindness. He's no longer a child, and this is the thing. He could feel that he's been very much emplaced like the son boy and the little brother for all that time, and now he's getting a bit grizzled, he's looking a bit naff, and, he's got a beard.
He's John video games.
He's a lot harder to parallel to these nice, perfect images people have. And I think, like we said prior, it's part of almost why I hope we do get just one more of those parallels with Thrall. I do hope Thrall approaches him with the idea of, oh, he reminds me so much of my son. Or even if the idea of him going to Anduin with, who you were reminds me so much of my son. This isn't who you are, Anduin. And maybe have Anduin snap and go, why is everyone doing this to me? Let me be me.
I'm 26 years old and I have a dick and balls, please, says Anduin in a weeping tone. The thing is that idea of actualization, like I said, actualization of adulthood and being like, I'm tired of people constantly seeing me as this very, very young person. I've done these things that aren't cool. I've felt things that have like made me feel strange and uncomfortable with myself. And you see when I remove the words, how this sounds like a certain thing.
Because one of those interesting where you could also honestly argue for this idea of, if you want to go for that idea of repression, how from age 17 to age, like 22 or whatever, he has essentially been repressed by his obligations this entire time. And now he is finally figuring out who he is. He is on his own, figuring out who he is independent from the pampered life of Stormwind. And maybe he likes getting a little rough and dirty. Maybe he likes being gruff hobo who keeps a beard and does all this stuff. And maybe that doesn't need to be connected to, oh, he's so much like Varian. And it can just be, he's Anduin, and this is what Anduin likes.
Yes, and this is the thing, and that's continuing on from my idea, compare and contrast him to Varian. Make him okay with realizing, yeah, I have some traits of my father, but I'm still me despite all of that. Like, I look in the mirror, I can still see a bit of Varian with this chin of mine, right? But it's me.
It's the difference between you're so much like your father versus I have these traits and my father also has these traits. It doesn't mean you got them from him. It just means these are a thing you share. This is something I can look on, not with sorrow for the father I lost, for the father I'm trying to emulate, but just some nostalgia of this is what my father was like, and in these ways I am like him.
Exactly. I'm a man now, and I do resemble my father in certain ways, but my father isn't me and I'm not my father. That is perfectly okay.
It's a perfect way to also have him not be king, because in those ways he doesn't need to put those things under the obligations of being king, because a lot of those traits Varian got were when he wasn't king, were when he was a gladiator, or when he didn't get to do those things. And ultimately him coming into his own as king was the combination of those versions of himself. Whereas that doesn't need to be the same for Anduin, because Anduin does not have two bodies being split with magic swords. He is just Anduin.
Exactly. And when we remove those sorts of ideas, like looking at Shadowlands, and I'm going to remove the actual words for it, like I was just saying before, what does this remind you of? I felt something new and it made me feel funny. This person who saw me as a little brother is sending me off by, using my title that used as a child to me for the last time, like no longer. It sounds like a coming of age story, but in a sense of realizing one's limitations on what one has been forced into as a child and the growth into a new person, i.e. the agency of adulthood. And being able for the first time ever to put your foot down in a Mandarin way and be like, that isn't for me. That is okay. And the thing is that struggling with that idea that he can now make those choices and no one can really stop him can be both positive and negative. That can hurt people around him. It can let people down.
If we're going into the war within and he is having these struggles with the light, if he decides to eschew, like let's say the ending of the Ringing Deeps, the second zone, has this confrontation with Thrall, where Thrall keeps nagging him about this, and he finally blows up at Thrall. Stop doing this to me. I am my own person. And he decides, okay, I'm going to go my own way into Hallowfall. I'm going to do my own thing separate from these people constantly nagging me, constantly comparing me to other people. And he runs into the Paladins in Hallowfall. And he starts getting ideas from them. These people don't have any connection to who he is. They don't even know he's a king. They just see him as Anduin. They see that he is someone struggling with the light, and they start teaching him things. And maybe the things they teach him aren't the best. Maybe the things they teach him in terms of reconnecting to the light are a bit feeding into that sadism. Feeding into the thing that he is so fearful of, that he said to Sylvanas, of that exhilaration he got. Maybe they're not really all that scared of that. Maybe they're like, that's okay under the light. put that to good use against someone. Put that to good use against the Nerubians. And he follows that.
And not only that, but I'm gonna do this in a way that's like very reminiscent to real life cults. The first thing that they teach him isn't bad. The next thing they teach him isn't bad either. The next thing they teach him isn't bad either. This is all pretty good. This is all turning up Millhouse, you know? Like, Anduin's having a great time. These people really respect him. He feels like he belongs. He feels like he's a friend. It feels great, man. Okay, the next thing they do is pretty good. Yeah, okay. The fifth thing they do isn't too cool. But Anduin is already in too deep. He doesn't really know this already because he's so eager to impress these new people who accept him for who he is. Despite, his fears that he might misuse the light or he may enjoy hurting people. They're like, no, brother, guide your light in divine retribution against your enemies. That will always be for good. And Anduin's like,
well, that's the thing, and it appeals very well to Anduin's very binary form of good and evil.
Yes, and Anduin's like, yeah, sure, okay, I can do that. Okay, so we're blasting some Nerubians. Okay, cool. And we blast some more Nerubians and we come back to town and they're like, brother, we have found a non-believer amongst us who wishes to leave. And Anduin's like, what? Like, yes, they've forsaken the light and they need to be punished. Punish this person for us, Anduin. And this guy's like, yeah, fuck you, bitch ass Anduin. You think it's so fucking cool. You think you can just come in and, you think you're so good with the light and everyone fucking loves you. And Anduin's like, you shut up, you don't know me. And they're like, oh, you're just an idiot and you don't know anything about us. You'll never be accepted here. And Anduin blasts that guy. And Anduin feels pretty good about it because he shut this guy up who's talking shit about him. And Anduin's like, okay. And they're like, okay, we'll take him out and we'll, punish him a bit more for trying to go against the light. And it's a slow progression. The zone would be great if you see Anduin's slow acceptance into this cult via this. And the end dungeon could possibly even have Anduin as a boss.
That would be fun. I do think if they're going to do that, it would probably need to be more slow burn of Anduin gets the good parts with the hints of the more sinister parts in the leveling. And then as we do the max level, then we see some of the more darker things. We see Anduin doubting himself at things because it's still Anduin in there. It's still Anduin who has that moral center, but he is so desperate to find that belonging, to find someone who validates him and validates him as someone who wields a light, validates him for these flaws, that he is willing to, even if reluctantly, go along with these things. He's willing to turn the other cheek.
Yeah, and oh, you're scared to use your light and hurt people? Don't worry. We're hurting against people who want to hurt us, it's okay. We'll all do it and you trust us. Right, Anduin? You trust us. We're your brothers. Come on, brothers and sisters of the light. Come on, you can do this. And Anduin's like, all right, for you guys. I can do it for you.
I think it would make an interesting parallel to Illyria in that she is very much the void version of this. And going down that question of how far are people willing to go down these rabbit holes of zealotry, of their commitment to fulfilling these duties on two very opposite ways, but are ultimately having the same effects on these mortal people. Of how far is Illyria willing to go into the void? How far is she willing to go to hurt other people in her pursuit of Xal'atath, who poses such a big threat? And maybe she isn't willing to go that far. And that's how Xal'atath escapes and causes midnight. And that continues her arc of her regretting stepping back from that and continuing to go down that arc in the void, while Anduin is being very validated by the light. And now midnight is being a very clear good light versus bad void. And we're probably going to be forming the real army of the light there and bringing in the Lightbound and bringing in the Sunwell stuff and seeing how Anduin reacts there. I would love Anduin to go into midnight with an unhealthy relationship to the light.
I'm going to suggest this. That initial part with the Arathi is kind of dealt with, right, in the zone. And we bring Anduin back from, I'm saying air quotes, the brink.
You could almost have this moment of, you could bring him back from the brink. We get the whole moment of, oh, no, these people are bad. We need to deal with them. We need to install better people here. Anduin pulls back from it. He helps us, obviously, because it's Anduin. And then we can get this moment of, oh, we're glad to have you back, Anduin. Thrall gives him a pat on the back. Anduin's nice. He's accepting. They all start heading into the Nerubian zone, or wherever, if we head to a next patch. And then as they're all away, we see Anduin alone, and he still ignites the light in his hand, because he is still following what he learned from them. No matter how guilty he feels about it, he has the light back. He has found a way to get the light back. He does not want to let go of this. He has found something in him that gives him the will to bring it back. He knows this is probably not good for him. He knows this is pretty toxic. But he has this thing that's so deeply defines his virtues. He cannot let go from it now.
The way that you would probably resolve that too, and I know that the WoW devs are shivering as I mention it now, it would be his friendship with Rathian, because it's turning that unhealthy focus into a healthy focus, because this is what I saw, like Rathian kind of catches him doing this, whether it be in Midnight or Last Titan or War Within, we don't know where Rathian's going to turn up again.
You could have that moment of him igniting that, having the guilt, and then he walks away, and in the background you just see the slightest flicker of red eyes.
Classic red eyes sneaking out through like a little bush. It's Rathian who's barely fitting in there these days. But yeah, it would need basically, and this is the thing where I'm like, they can handle it in the short term where it's like just that sort of zone, hit max level. Anduin can either be a boss in the dungeon of the Arathi, right? Like saying, no, I found my purpose now with them, you can't interrupt this. And much like people, when you do try and pull them out of cults, people get upset. You have to be very, very careful about pulling people away from cults, because it's the idea of like when you start suffering brainwashing, because it essentially is, people become very tetchy about leaving that comfort. It's leaving something that's known to them, even if it's bad, even if it's toxic. That's why people dob in family members when people try and leave cults and things like that, because you're so deeply ingrained and you know this sense of belonging comes above all others. Now, they can handle that, like we said, in the long term or the short term. And the short term would be wrapping it up in the zone, but still having Anduin's doubts about that. But if they have Rathian in the War Within, it can be Anduin replaces that sort of hollow sense of like, well, maybe I'm never meant to belong anywhere, and Rathian comes along and says, hey, and Anduin's like, you know, and that sort of so he sort of replaces it with something good, and that's why I've always suggested something bad happens to Rathian, which causes them, because, you know, healing isn't a straight line. If something threatens that sort of like progress in healing, you can tilt very quickly into bad habits again. And like I said, it's like substance use, being in a cult. Often people latch onto a person after those situations to sort of help and guide them. So you can imagine the absolute trauma it causes if something happens to said person, especially if that person's actually a positive influence on their life. It's a very law-based thing too. People coming out of prison, you often need a very safe and secure network when you come out of like incarceration, so you don't fall into bad habits, which is usually drug use. So if they put that into a fantasy setting, let's just transfer that sort of idea into this setting. If Anduin gets addicted to that sort of kinship that he gets with the Arathi, the way that they use the light, and he becomes like almost dependent on it and their beliefs and their teachings, or maybe their convictions, dedicated to listening to that. And if he wants to break away from that, he needs to be very careful about his support network after that. So anything that affects that can quickly tip him in a very bad direction. If they want to do it long term, I like you said, Paul, that is a perfect idea. Them sort of wrapping it up and maybe Anduin not being a boss in the Arathi dungeon, right? But maybe being resistant against it, or trying to halt the group from doing this initially, or maybe going along with the group because Anduin wants to talk to the leader, but it turns sour very quickly, so they dispatch the cult leader, but Anduin starts a lingering want to be in this sort of situation with the cult and how they use the light. And that can definitely be arced over into Midnight and be a good sort of compare and contrast to the wielders of Shadow, and an unhealthy relationship with the light, and having to balance that with like the Shadow and stuff like that. And then that also still allows for Rathian's friendship to kick in as almost if they want to do it long term. Anduin's really been struggling this whole time. He makes some really bad decisions, but the one person, you know, who does have unshakable faith in him is Rathian, despite everything.
Despite everything, it's still you.
Despite everything, it's still you. And Rathian and him start learning to work together, and, you know, the sort of reflective mirror of their own guilt of actions that they've done in the past, but realizing they can get over that. They can take action and steps to do positive things in their life, and their previous mistakes don't define them. Dumb. So I think that's like a good sort of like short-term sort of idea and a long-term idea. And it also touches again on that idea of the story of adulthood, like coming into your own as an adult, dare I say, with free choice and one's own sort of determination and agency. And I think that would create a very interesting story in regards to like that. It's like, okay, you have every choice possible as an adult. What choice are you going to make? And Anduin's like, I'm going to make a bad choice. And Jaina's like, okay, not cool, but you are an adult, so you can make these bad choices. That's the thing about being an adult. You will make bad choices. It's like much like when you're a child too, you will continue to make bad choices when you're a young adult as well. And you'll continue to make stupid choices in your life. You can just hope that the next time you run into it, you can handle it better. And I think that's a good idea for the Manduin aspect, dear God. The Manduin aspect to come into it is Anduin makes mistakes as an adult, but understands his impact in doing so. And that's, if they want to handle the cult thing short term, him realizing that resisting against like Thrall or maybe Jaina's there, or pushing back against them in a cruel way or shunning them is cruel and it's petty and it's selfish, you know, or because he was now obsessed with his new best culty buddies, you know, it's cruel. But it's what people who are trapped in cults tend to do. You tend to be cruel and like isolate away from your family and say cruel things to them and say you're going to go to hell, let's just say, because you're not a part of the cult or something. That all makes sense.
You're gonna go to the mall, so honest.
I'm gonna go to the mall and I know it's real because I've seen it.
Okay, well, we've both talked quite a lot. Sil, do you have any thoughts about the future of Anduin?
No, I am still feeling the burn of Shadowlands disappointment. So I have one hope, and I hope it's that they actually go into what he did while under the jailer's mind control, if they're going to go through with giving him angst over, quote unquote, the things that he did.
I do think the short story is the best place to do that, of just like at least introducing with the idea of, if we're going to go through the idea of his perspective, we do need his perspective of what it was like in his head during that moment. And the only place you can really do that for WoW is the books and the short stories. So I do think if we're starting with Anduin at his lowest point, him racked with guilt over his feelings there, racked with uncertainty over the exhilaration he felt there, amidst flashes to the things he was doing during that point, would be kind of a good place to start.
Yeah, exactly. I do have a teeny tiny microscopic grain of hope for the short story because I unexpectedly loved the Rathian one. I think I even like it revisiting it now.
Let's hope that Anduin doesn't get the same Rathian treatment.
Right. Not that the short story was a harbinger of good things to come in Dragonflight itself, but at least that exists in isolation. So maybe we'll get a good.
I will say this. I think the issue was with Rathian in-game is, again, I think the behind-the-scenes devs takes on Rathian that, oh my god, people like him because he's stupid and he's silly and it's so funny when he gets punched. And as terrible as that sounds coming out my mouth, I do actually think the devs considered that in their writing, and it really shone through, and it was really the wrong take. And again, this would have been solved with a little bit more awareness of the community, I think, rather than relying on what their friends are saying on Twitter about what was great about this character.
I'm definitely sick of callbacks to that punch. I think that needs to end. Everyone remembers that it happened. Like, there's no need to bring it up.
Like we said, I think the callback we need is Rathian expecting something when they finally meet again, and just going with of course Anduin's not going to do that now. Why would Anduin do that now? Give him a hug, give him just a pat, if we're being...
no homo.
A handshake.
Yeah, it's like hey, Anduin is glad to see him. Anduin is in a much less high horse of a position than he was back then.
God, I hope so.
They got to do the side hug, so leave room for Jesus. I mean, the jailer.
I think that would be the best way to reference it, is just like Rathian flinches expecting something horrible. And of course, Anduin isn't going to do that. And that puts it to end.
Anduin dives in for a hug. That's all we can hope. It puts it to end.
Which in itself has the very high obligation of, is Rathian going to be in the expansion at all? Which is a different story.
Oh, actually, we're going to go on a positive note here. I'm going to address Sil's point here. First of all, Sil, never trust how you feel about Warcraft's writing after 3 a.m. in the morning. And that is you at the moment.
True.
It's still 12:40 for me.
You're like, I have no hope. It's not going to go well. Girl, get some water in you.
I have water right here. I've been drinking it.
Have a rest. Have a sleep. Have brekkie. Wake up in the morning. Feel the sun's rays hit your face gently. And then see how you feel about your hopes and dreams for Anduin's writing that and Rathian's return there. It'll be better.
My highest hopes are that Anduin returns. He ditches Charlemagne, puts Charlemagne to rest, and becomes a priest. And we see him in cloth armor at some point. I really want to see him in priest robes. He can be on the battlefield, he can be fighting, but I would like to see him as a priest, and that to be more of the forefront, or to have him return to that. I think that would be nice.
Even if you keep Charlemagne, just getting him out of the plate, getting him out of this very clear emulation of Varian and into something that fits him, not as King of Stormwind, not as the son of Varian, just the adventurer he wants to be, the do-gooder he wants to be out in the world. And putting him in cloth, putting him in a practical outfit would be a nice way to kind of bring that to a close, of something that has nothing to do with any of his other outfits.
I nearly lost it when I saw that he was still wearing that stupid armor in the cinematic. I was so angry. I wanted an outfit change so bad.
I will say this, they need to save money, obviously. It's the dumbest thing they could save money on, but they're still sticking with it because they're probably like, we'll have to do a totally new model in the future for him, so we might as well get the most use out of this as possible. Also, they need to give Anduin something like this. Hold on, I'm trying to go for I'm trying to find, bear with me, gang.
I think I might know what you're talking about. I'm going to link it. Is it this artist's stuff?
I love that for him.
Oh, George's.
I love these pieces.
I do too. They're amazing.
Georgia does such a good job, may I just say, with those. Like, holy shit. But anyway, this is what Anduin needs to wear. It's the traditional bloody cleric D&D outfits. Like, they have all this choice, and it's like, okay, you already have your priest-like characters. Give this man the semi-armor, cool-ass fucking cloak, breeches, cool boots look. Go with that. That's all they need to do. So it's like a nice combination between cloth, and then they can add a little bit of armor if they want. It's the cleric D&D look.
Cleric D&D look like this would also be very acceptable to me.
Yeah, it's that kind of midway. It's not armored per se.
Someone needs to go at him with like a can opener or something.
Like this, like the chainmail under the tunic and stuff like this lady's wearing here.
Oh yeah, that's nice too.
Yeah, it will have like the chainmail arms, and like it usually has the high neck cloak and stuff like that. That's what they need to give Anduin, because it sets him apart from so many other characters. It has a little bit nice of a call to Khadgar, which we want Anduin to sort of follow in a role of Khadgar, you know, more of a traveling sort of character who engages with multiple different peoples, but it still gives him that priestly look, but also still gives him a kind of semi-armored look too. So it's a nice balance. So he's not a villain full robes, not full priest robes, but it's close enough. It's his own sort of like twist on things.
I think that more or less brings things to a close. I think my closing statement is that I, as always, am putting my faith in Sylvanas Windrunner to be right.
That's a good closing statement for it.
I have faith in her belief in Anduin's freedom to make choices, and I hope that she is not proven wrong in the future. I hope that her closing statements are very definitive.
You know what? We're going to close this with, we are now Sylvanas stands 1001%.
I have faith in your faith in Sylvanas, and I am a Sylvanas fan myself, so I like your interpretation of that cutscene. I'm still holding to my pessimistic version, but I'm willing to be pleasantly surprised when the War Within comes around and we start getting more patches leading up to that.
Well, this is a very good job of timeliness for us to end it, because this is potentially the week just before 10.2.6 comes out, and subsequently the PTR for 10.2.7, so we may or may not be seeing Anduin very soon in testing, and subsequently Alpha is probably within the next month or two, so we will be seeing him soon.
Unless he's a box. Picture of the blue and white checkered box right now. I agree. I'm still going to say that Anduin is going to come back in a dark cart, 100%. And we'll say that if he isn't in, I don't think he's in this patch.
No, obviously.
This patch is just going to be for funsies. I think it's just going to be I'm actually going to say it's going to be around the world treasure hunt.
Probably, yeah.
It's going to be very similar to the Mysteries of Azeroth.
Just on a world scale, yeah.
Yeah, just on a world scale. And maybe more pirates involved. Maybe sky pirates.
Probably a bit more active combat, too. Something to whet the appetite.
Yeah, it'll probably have like an emboss and something like that. Maybe a few other like little...
I'm fairly confident we'll see Flynn Fairwind. He will have his fun.
Oh, I hope so.
And maybe we'll even get some pirate marks. Who knows?
Feel free to put up I'm Boo Boo the Fool here if we get nothing right.
I'm going to say, you haven't been pessimistic, Sil. You're just metering your hopes.
I'm tempering my expectations. I was burned really badly by Dragonflight as well, so I'm trying to be a little more realistic.
It's very funny coming into this being the optimistic one. It's refreshing in some ways, because I am oftentimes on Twitter seen as a very pessimistic person, a very critical person.
I've gone on a little rant to Sil one time, Port, when people were like, oh my god, Portergauge, why are you saying this? And I was like, Port is the most fucking optimistic person on here. Shut your traps about it. It's like, seriously, you're worried about what you said. 100% not. You have very, very fair criticisms.
Yes.
I said that before, and I'm like, dude, one of the people who has the most balanced criticisms out there. Like, like no doubt about it.
Hopefully that shines through in the last 12 hours or so that we recorded.
Actually, I think generally on the plus side, I think we actually have been mostly positive here. We're just cautious, I think. And I think it's a lot to do with how Rathian was handled. However, this is my final point on that. I don't think they do Anduin dirty like they do Rathian dirty.
No, at the very least, Anduin is undoubtedly going to get proper focus. He is not going to have moments of randomly shuffling off screen because the plot doesn't need him. We can be sure that for better or worse, Anduin will be the focus.
He's not going to be used for cheap jokes.
Anduin's not going to be throwing rocks. He's not going to be called stinky or smelly. It's not going to be anything like that. He's not going to be used for cheap jokes.
Oh yeah, that reminds me. That is my one, not hope, but demand from Blizzard, is that there needs to be at least one line, voice acted preferably, with a character referring to how badly Anduin smells after spending so much time in the wilderness.
I think that honor needs to go to Magni.
Yes.
Even a crystal dwarf can smell how bad you smell from here, Anduin. But they won't, though. I'm putting my finger up. They won't. They'll be like, oh my god, you complained about Rathian smells. And I'm like, yes, that was something different. Me hissing and frothing at the mouth here.
Perhaps on Stinky, Smelly Anduin and Faith in the Dark Lady, we can bring this to a close after all these hours.
Yes, I think on the average, we've actually been quite positive about it. We're cautiously optimistic for the short story. Even with my complaints, I still like the Rathian one, dare I say it, and we're hopeful for that. We're hoping for the best outcome that allows Anduin to grow as a character, and I think that's our main point here, because if you limit Anduin as a character, he will become a dead end for characterization. He needs to be a character that can grow.
It's really just, I think a good closing point for me is that Anduin is very much the symbol of post-Warcraft 3 WoW character, in that he is, for all intents and purposes, the protagonist of WoW. He is very much the face of the franchise being something more than just nostalgia for a 20-year game. And I very much hope that in their continued efforts of having his nostalgia for things like Arthas, that we can move on from that we can give Anduin something new, not only for his character, but for the franchise, of something that defies just Return of the King, like what Varian got, that defies the Arthas parallels that he's had through Shadowlands, that just gives him something that makes Anduin and not defined by everyone else. Because, like we've said, Anduin has a very fraught history of being defined by others, and there's so much potential to define him by anything else.
This man deserves his own friends. He deserves his own adventures. He does deserve those kinds of things. He needs to... I mean, he's just been a character that's just had these things heaped on him, essentially. And as we've talked about, not always handled in the best way that allow his character to grow. Instead, he's taken a very highly passive role. And the thing is that growth. And I think Anduin should be a sign of the growth from those old games to something new within World of Warcraft.
And just a growth of the franchise, not only since places like Cataclysm and the weirdness there, but even growth from places like BFA, from growth from Shadowlands, even growth from Dragonflight, in terms of being able to treat all the characters of the story with nuance, not just the main focus characters. And even though Anduin is undoubtedly a focus character, I hope that for once a character like Anduin and his development won't come at the cost of others. I hope that Anduin can very much be a symbol of the franchise maturing, and not only the franchise maturing, but the franchise maturing in a way that fits what the franchise is, and not just what we got in the last two expansions, to put it nicely.
Just some sort of grand ideal and not being able to meter up to it, essentially. They need a story that they can tell, and I think that's a sense of maturity, isn't it? Having a story that you can tell successfully in a way that resonates with a lot of people. And I feel that
I mean, ultimately, it's on a writer and its vision, and I think Chris Metzen left the company and left the WoW writing team a good while back, and I do think, from what he said, from what he's shown, he has very much matured since then, not only as a person, but as a writer, and I do hope that is reflected in his writing here and in his leadership. Not only in the actual writing, but in his ability to lead other writers, and his ability to craft a cohesive story, wherein past WoW has often failed.
And not rely too heavily on other media to inform your story as well. I hope that WoW finds that voice again. Like I said, I know the devs are eyeing Lord of the Rings like, tasty.
If nothing else, Chris Metzen is a very creative fellow. He is very much a D&D nerd. He is very much a homebrewed fantasy guy. Hopefully that can translate into the setting under his leadership.
Exactly, and they can understand like the general wants of fans who are like invested in the lore, not just interested, but invested in the lore, because I think that would actually really help your game to flourish. I feel like these sorts of ideas would work well within the setting. It's the same with Anduin. Like I've noticed the large sway towards Anduin being more of a transformative character, and the people crying out for Anduin to just be a king again and have an heir to be reducing and reducing and reducing over time too.
Which ultimately is largely a dead end. That is the kind of story that ends Anduin as a character. And I think Anduin has the potential to be, like I've said, our post-Warcraft 3 versions of main protagonists. The characters that can live on forever in the franchise, can grow and change. And even if they end an arc, it doesn't need to end their character.
And the thing is that maybe after the World Soul saga, Anduin can have his break. He could go for a tropical island tour with like Rathian, and they can actually have a book together. Exploring Azeroth's isles and islands? No. Exploring Azeroth's bars and dives with Rathian and Anduin.
Who knows? Maybe the short story will make Anduin a drunk too.
I can only hope.
Or maybe it'll make him like a nail biter or something. What's another very minor?
He's clumsy like Bella Swan.
He has to like fold his clothes. He can't just take his clothes off. He has to fold them very neatly. It's very pedantic, man.
I mean, at its core, I think that's a good place to end of. Out of all of this, the biggest message first and foremost is let Anduin be flawed.
Please give him flaws.
That's the best thesis statement to end this on, is let Anduin be flawed.
And not to sound like a cheesy old white woman, but shit would be breathtaking for that transformative change for Anduin. I think it'd also transform Warcraft in certain ways too. It's powerful. As Sil said on the last time, it's powerful.
Give him flaws and make him stink.
Well, do we want to end there? Do we want to have that be our final statement? That's our criteria, Blizzard. If you take anything away from this, Anduin should be flawed and Anduin should be stinky. And no.
Guys, thank you so much for joining in there. I think we covered all of our points and
in excruciating depth.
Thank you for everyone listening in and wanted to know like a deep dive on Anduin and know our general thought. I think we not only touched on what our criticisms are, but also the points that were good, and we also offered some possibilities. I mean, obviously offering what you can do isn't always the most helpful, but I hope at least this gets some brain juices going in regards to possibilities of story writing and how one can develop a character and make them enjoyable for an audience. And that often relies on the character having more depth to them other than just a singular nebulous goal about them. It's about making them human or draconic or elven, whatever that may be. But yes, so thank you so much, guys. And I hope everyone enjoys too and has learned a bit about Anduin. Thank you so much.